3 minutes after 10 is the time. Do you know, I nearly began then with an opening that would have echoed slightly Holly Willoughby on the telly a week or two ago. But I wouldn't have been doing it tongue-in-cheek. I almost did something like, take a deep breath, are you okay? And I couldn't quite remember why that would have sounded so odd in the current. And then I remembered, of course, that you'd have thought that I was poking fun at her when I genuinely wasn't. I think it is a morning to take a deep breath. Listen, we'll approach it as if it had happened an hour ago. All right? We've had most of Friday, Saturday and Sunday to absorb the, I think, inevitable collapse of Boris Johnson. Whether or not it is the final collapse, only time will tell. But we did Friday's show actually quite premonitionally. Is that a word? Premonitionally? What would be a better word than premonitionally? Friday's show was quite prescient. There you go. Because we kind of talked about Boris Johnson and Donald Trump as if both had reached the end of their road. I was working on the presumption that the Privileges Committee would set fire to his latest ludicrous attempts to evade reality and the truth. And then sooner than anyone expected, they did. He got butchers at the report. I'm told it's about a 20-day suspension that he would have faced, and brave Sir Boris ran away, as he always does, like all cowards, always running away. And as I've told you on approximately 7 million times on this programme, he always makes any decision entirely on the basis of what is best for him in the very short term. So getting to rubbish the report before the report has been published, getting to malign the members of the committee before the members of the committee have seen their report in the public space is the typical act of a corrupt coward, which is what he has always been. Although I accept that it took some of you a little bit longer to understand that and to fully appreciate the depth of his depravity than it took me and many other people who've been listening to this programme for the last few years. And what are the last few years, if not defined by Boris Johnson, Donald Trump and Brexit in this country? 3 projects, stroke individuals that have now been revealed almost completely to be complete cons. Con men, con jobs, con artists. Spectacular, really, to reflect that, you know, even people like Andrew Neil were publishing articles under the headline, Donald Trump won't be as bad as you think, in the middle of all this mess, while some of us were screaming, actually, not just from the sidelines, but occasionally from the centre circles, screaming about the direction of traffic. The BBC this weekend still putting Farage back on the telly, still treating him like an honest broker or some sort of valid contributor to the national pageant. Absolutely breathtaking. And then when Grant Shapps lied to Laura Kuenssberg about Gordon Brown's dissolution honours list, she A, didn't notice, and then when she came round to a correction, she pretended that it was only nerds and pub quiz champions who would be interested in the actual truth about what happened when Gordon Brown ceased to be Prime Minister and an honours list was published, as opposed to what Grant Shapps lied about. Later that day, Grant Shapps, of course, who was famous before politics famous when he first came into politics for selling get-rich-quick schemes on the internet under a false name, claimed that he'd voted for Brexit, despite having told us on several occasions in the past that he actually voted for Remain. So it's not a time to celebrate. The damage that's been done is permanent, or at least the stains that are left upon British democracy and British politics are not going to be rubbed out by the disappearance, perhaps the temporary disappearance of, well, man, those 3 things were off the top of my head, by the way. The BBC's flagship political show, not only giving space to Farage, but also failing to notice Grant Shapps' latest lies, and then when they were pointed out, reluctantly and very sneeringly claiming that it was only of interest to pub quiz champions and, quotes, nerds, end quotes. And then the rest of it, Gove, doing the rounds today, not really being reminded that he went from being absolutely persuaded that Boris Johnson was unfit to being Prime Minister to holding about 704 jobs in his various cabinets. It is breathtaking. And Michael Gove, of course, is the same bloke that went to America to interview Donald Trump without telling anybody that Rupert Murdoch was sitting in the room at the time. So if you're thinking, phew, it's over, we're out of the woods, we're not. We're not out of the woods yet. Rishi Sunak this morning attempting to stick a Gucci loafered toe on the moral high ground while completely forgetting the fact not only that Boris Johnson overruled the House of Lords Appointment Committee on numerous occasions in the past while he sat quietly by as his Chancellor of the Exchequer, but also that he put Suella Braverman back in the Cabinet 6 days after she was forced to resign for breaking the ministerial code in the most egregious fashion. Priti Patel heading off. You don't get the House of Lords, do you, if you're a dame? Priti Patel, there is nothing like a dame. That's probably the line I should have opened with. She, of course, remained in the Cabinet after being found to be a bully. Boris Johnson let her. So I don't know really what it is today, but I do know that Fridays, I don't know if you were listening on Friday, and I can't work too much on the presumption that you were, but it was an odd. I'd almost lost my mojo on Friday, and I worked out why. It's because of what I've just explained to you, just because it's now coming down. Those of us who aren't complete idiots do not derive enormous pleasure from drinking other people's tears or revelling in the upset and unhappiness of, quotes, all the right people. Those of us who care about this country remain crushed by what has been done to it, remain crushed by the prominence and the success of deeply unsavoury individuals like Boris Johnson and stupid ideas waved through by about 80% of my profession, like Brexit. There's no celebration when you see it all fall apart. There's no celebration when you see justice finally catch up with Boris Johnson, objective reality finally finding a way to actually restrain him. What are you supposed to celebrate? What are you supposed to celebrate? Look at the damage that's been done. Look at our international standing. Look at what the rest of the world thinks about us. Look at inflation. Oh, Germany's got a recession. Yeah, the whole point about Brexit is that however bad things are, being out of the European Union would make them worse. So if you think Germany's got economic problems now and you're clinging to that desperate carcass in the hope of pretending that you're not part of the most absurd act of national self-harm in the history of democracy, then you are once again overlooking the fact that bad things are worse when you're out of the biggest single market on the planet than they would be if you were in it. We had recessions while we were in the European Union. Brave Sir Boris ran away, bravely ran away. When danger reared its ugly head, he bravely turned his tail and fled. Yes, brave Sir Boris turned about, and gallantly he chickened out. Swiftly taking to his feet, he beat a very brave retreat. Bravest of the brave, Sir Boris. Should we start with the resignation? I'm going to do this cold. I had a look at it on Friday. I haven't had a look at it since, but I think we can probably, between us, fact-check it live, can't we? We'll begin here. I have received a letter from the Privileges Committee making it clear, much to my amazement, that they are determined to use the proceedings against me to drive me out of Parliament. That's a lie. For a start, the committee has a majority of Conservative MPs. A majority of Conservative MPs, including Bernard Jenkin and Charles Walker, both, to use that ludicrous phrase that became so popular not long ago, both ardent Brexiteers. A majority of Conservative MPs containing, quotes, ardent Brexiteers, end quotes, simply make recommendations upon which the House of Commons can vote. The House of Commons, of course, maintains a healthy majority for the Conservative Party. So a Conservative majority committee puts its findings before a Conservative majority House and asks them to vote upon the future of a Conservative politician. Boris Johnson clearly decided they would vote to suspend him. I'm told 20 days would have been the recommendation. That prompts the possibility of a by-election. A by-election in a Conservative majority constituency, Uxbridge and Ruislip. So Boris Johnson's claim of being driven out of Parliament hinges upon the idea that a Conservative majority committee can put its findings before a Conservative majority House of Commons and then lead to a by-election in a Conservative majority constituency. Confident that he would lose all three, he lies about being driven out of Parliament. The next line, they have still not produced a shred of evidence that I knowingly or recklessly misled the Commons. Leaving aside the fact that we all saw him do it, that is an observation of such epic fatuousness that it barely merits analysis. The report hasn't been published, so any claims that you make about it prior to publication must be treated with exactly the same respect as the claims you made about there not being any parties, and then the claims you made about there being any parties but you not knowing about them, and then the claims that you made about there being parties but you didn't know about, and you did know about them but you didn't go to them, and then the claims that you made about there being parties and you did know about them and you did go to them but you didn't realise that they were parties, and then the ludicrous claims that you made about it all being relatively innocuous, and there's absolutely nothing wrong at all with people living it up on the night that the Queen was waiting to bury her husband. They know perfectly well that when I spoke in the Commons, I was saying what I believed sincerely to be true and what I had been briefed to say like any other minister. Great sentence, that. Wasn't my fault I told a lie, and I honestly believed that it was the truth when I told it. Remember, this is the bloke who said there hadn't been any parties, that he hadn't been to any parties, that he had been to a party and he didn't know that there had been parties, and yet he claims that when he stood up and told the House of Commons that there hadn't been any parties, that there had been parties, but he hadn't realised what he was doing, and if he had, it was all somebody else's fault. That narcissist's prayer is ringing in our ears already, isn't it? They know that I corrected the record as soon as possible, not true, and they know that I and every other senior official and minister, including the current Prime Minister and then occupant of the same building, Rishi Sunak, believed that we were working lawfully together. They do not know that. They categorically can't know that, and if they did know that, they wouldn't have found that you were in contempt of Parliament. And when I say they, I mean the Conservative Majority Privileges Committee featuring two self-professed ardent Brexiteers. I have been an MP since 2001. Incredibly, that's not true either. He ceased to be an MP when he became Mayor of London and returned to the House of Commons only after he'd finished his 2 terms as Mayor of London. So even that simple sentence there, not even an opinion, it's counting. He can't even get that right. I have been an MP since 2001. I take my responsibility seriously. Of course you do. I let that one hang, frankly. That doesn't even need me to start picking at. I did not lie, and I believe that in their hearts the committee know it. Absolute bilge, and really unpleasant propaganda as well, because it's the stab in the back mythology. It's the claim that the people telling the truth are the real liars. It's the pretense that an objective investigation into wrongdoing is somehow motivated by anything other than a desire to highlight wrongdoing. Why? Because democracy depends on it. Why do I say that? Because all we have to protect ourselves from powerful people are rules and standards and regulations, or red tape, as Jacob Rees-Mogg likes to call them. That's all we have as a people to protect us from powerful people and wealth being free to do whatever they want to do with us, to reduce us to a state of serfdom or vassal status. That's all we have. The rules, the regulations, the standards, which is why people like Jacob Rees-Mogg are so desperate to set fire to them. But they have willfully chosen to ignore the truth because from the outset their purpose has not been to discover the truth or genuinely to understand what was in my mind when I spoke in the Commons. So now they're supposed to be mind readers. Boris Johnson's mind, that place where smiling piccaninnies dance through his consciousness, that place where women wearing burqas look like letterboxes, that place, Boris Johnson's mind, where lying to wives and mistresses and colleagues and party leaders and constituents is a perfectly normal and acceptable mode of behaviour. Boris Johnson's mind they should have been reading in order to know that while he was actually saying things that were untrue, he didn't really understand that they were untrue because, well, in my words, he wouldn't know the truth if it slapped him round the face with a wet kipper. The purpose from the beginning has been to find me guilty regardless of the facts. Again, you can only say that before publication of the report. Again, he makes his decisions based entirely on that nanosecond of self-interest. Because once the report comes out, all of this falls apart like a cheap suit. But the client journalists, the forelock tuggers and the capped offers have already been given their script. You'll be hearing this script. You'll be reading this script on the front of the Mail, the front of the Telegraph. That's the script that they've been handed. Kangaroo court, stitch up, witch hunt, absolute rollicks. But it's too late now for any of them to turn around and admit the scale of the deception that they've fallen for. This, he says, is the very definition of a kangaroo court. I think cobblers is the closest I can come to pinning down that particular description. Most members of the committee, especially the chair, had already expressed deeply prejudicial remarks about my guilt before they had even seen the evidence. They should have recused themselves. Well, Chris Bryant did, leaving a Conservative majority on a committee where some members had indeed expressed outrage at the idea of there being parties in Downing Street during lockdown. That's not even an opinion. It was outrageous that there were parties in Downing Street during lockdown. It's not prejudicial to be outraged by the outrageous. It is pathetic to pretend that you don't understand that, and yet more evidence that you can't even lie straight in bed at night. In retrospect, it was naive and trusting of me to think that these proceedings could be remotely useful or fair. In retrospect, it was naive and trusting of 17 million people to think that you could be trusted with the future of the United Kingdom, or that there'd be £350 million a week to spend on the NHS, or that you would be able to somehow effect a Brexit without having checks on goods coming into or out of Northern Ireland, or that illegally proroguing Parliament and sending Jacob Rees-Mogg to Balmoral to lie to the Queen would somehow be a breach of behaviour so egregious that action would be taken. I could go on. But I was determined to believe in the system. I was determined to believe in the system. This is a man who put at least 2 people in the House of Lords against the express advice of the security services and or the House of Lords Appointments Committee. I was determined to believe in the system. This is the man who lost not 1 but 2 independent advisors on ministerial standards because he refused to observe or obey independent advice on ministerial standards. The second of the 2, Lord Geit, reportedly left after telling a friend, "I've had enough, I'm sick of being lied to." But yeah, that's right. Boris Johnson was determined to believe in the system and in justice, and to vindicate what I knew to be the truth. One example, if you've got it, one example from Boris Johnson's entire political career where he could be said to have told the truth in the face of other people's falsehoods. Just one. I'll wait. It was the same faith in the impartiality of our systems that led me to commission Sue Gray. It is clear that my faith has been misplaced. Front page of the Daily Mail after Sue Gray's report was published. Is that it? Question mark. The forelock tuggers, the cap doffers, the client journalists queuing up to claim that that report was a vindication, queuing up to claim that it was a damp squib, that it didn't prove anything at all, and that it was nowhere near grounds for Boris Johnson's defenestration. And guess what? It wasn't the grounds for Boris Johnson's defenestration. His own party, the Conservative Party, after the resignation of countless ministers, finally showed in the door because he'd lied about the appointment of a well-known sex pest to a senior role in the Whip's office. It had nothing to do with Sue Gray's report. Of course, it suits the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats and the SNP to do whatever they can to remove me from Parliament. Again, the decision to remove him from Parliament would be taken upon the advice of a Conservative majority committee after a vote in a Conservative majority House of Commons and a recall by-election in a Conservative majority constituency. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's only the first 6 paragraphs. It constitutes about half a page of a 2-page statement. So we're going to have to pause. 22 minutes after 10. Where were we? Oh, yes, of course, it suits the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats and the SNP to do whatever they can to remove me from Parliament. The only people who can remove Boris Johnson from Parliament are the constituents of Uxbridge and Ruislip, who would be offered that opportunity if and only if a Conservative majority House of Commons voted to allow them to do so. Cowardice and lies. We turn the page. Sadly, as we saw in July last year, there are currently some Tory MPs who share that view. Absolute nonsense. Ministers appointed by you, some on several different occasions, finally ran out of patience. When you called for support, when you raised your standard in the public space on Friday, the only person who turned up to support you was Nadine Dorries. That's the extent of the base that some bizarre corners of the British media continue to think is somehow similar to Donald Trump's. I am not alone in thinking that there is a witch hunt underway. That bit's true. Nadine Dorries also thinks there's a witch hunt underway. But that, and Jacob Rees-Mogg. So we'll give him that one. The first thing, we're on top of page 2. I am not alone in thinking that there is a witch hunt underway. And then he loses the plot again. To take revenge for Brexit and ultimately to reverse the 2016 referendum result. A result which, of course, he picked a side on the night before posting the column that he'd prepared in advance. My removal is the necessary first step. This is the stab in the back mythology again, and I believe there has been a concerted attempt to bring it about. I'm afraid I no longer believe that it is any coincidence that Sue Gray, who investigated gatherings in Number 10, is now the Chief of Staff designate of the Labour leader. Back to Sue Gray again. Is that it? The Daily Mail front page. A damp squib. Boris Johnson's allies. It has completely vindicated and exonerated me, Boris Johnson. So how come now is it evidence of some sort of conspiracy when it was actually published and, in retrospect, found to have gone nowhere near as far as it could conceivably have done, not least because we now know about other gatherings at Chequers and Downing Street which weren't investigated by her, but are currently being investigated by the police? How can that possibly be evidence of any sort of conspiracy? If only there was some sort of committee, some sort of independent committee to which the appointment could be referred and upon which they could then adjudge the suitability. Oh, there is, and they have, and there's no case to answer, despite the desperate attempts of the Daily Mail and various other client journalists to pretend that there was, as with Keir Starmer's curry up in Durham. Nor do I believe that it is any coincidence that her supposedly impartial chief counsel, Daniel Stillitz KC, turned out to be a strong Labour supporter who repeatedly tweeted personal attacks on me and the government. Infamy, infamy, they've all got it in for me. There are no honest people in British politics. There are no honest people in British public life who haven't been disgusted or outraged by Boris Johnson's conduct over the last few years. It would be literally impossible to find somebody honest who didn't think he was despicable. When I left office last year, the government was only a handful of points behind in the polls. That gap has now massively widened. At the time, his personal popularity was, I think, the lowest ever for any sitting Prime Minister, although presumably Liz Truss came along and overtook him on that score. Liz Truss, of course, his anointed successor after the defenestration. Just a few years after winning the biggest majority in almost half a century, that majority is now clearly at risk because it was built entirely on lies, and the lies are now coming home to roost, and people are unlikely to vote for the person who lied to them once they realise that they've been lied to, with the obvious exceptions previously mentioned. Our party needs urgently to recapture its sense of momentum and its belief in what this country can do. We need to show how we are making the most of Brexit. How long are they going to need for that? How long are they going to need for that? How long until the benefits arrive, lads? Seriously. This Brexit, this brilliant Brexit that goes to a different school, can you at least describe it to us? Can you tell us what it looks like? I still see it in Idiot's Corner. Brexit hasn't even been done yet. He was your hero. He was your boy for the duration. He was the one that kept feeding you Remainer tears for you to feast upon. And now he's the problem? He's the one who hasn't delivered Brexit? He's the one claiming that we're not making the most of it, and we need in the next months to be setting out a pro-growth and pro-investment agenda. We need to cut business and personal taxes, and not just as pre-election gimmicks, rather than endlessly putting them up. Yeah, because you have a look at the state of this country and you think that you need less money for public services. We must not be afraid to be a properly conservative government. Why have we so passively abandoned the prospect of a free trade deal with the US? Because you don't decide whether you sign a free trade deal with the US. The US decides whether the UK signs a free trade deal with the US, and Joe Biden has made it painstakingly clear that they have little or no interest in pursuing that project at this time. If only somebody had warned us. Oh, they did. Barack Obama, exposed to racist and evidence-free abuse by Boris Johnson's supporters when he described where we would be in the context of a trade deal with the United States as being at the back of the queue. This country, thanks to organs like the Mail and the Telegraph and plenty of people in broadcasting, elected to believe that Nigel Farage had a better grasp of international trade prospects for post-Brexit Britain and America than the President of the United States of America at that time, Barack Obama. The mind boggles. Why have we junked measures to help people into housing, or to scrap EU directives, or to promote animal welfare? Where do you even start? Tell me what these EU directives are. How many years did I sit here for? Asking people, Boris Johnson's people, to tell me what the rules were, what the laws were, what the problems were. What is it that you want to get rid of? What are you so desperate to get rid of? And do you know who's just realised what a stupid project that was? Kemi blooming Badenoch, another ardent Brexiteer dedicated to ripping up red tape, who, when presented with all the red tape that people like Johnson are still claiming that we should be ripping up, ran away and explained that it would be ridiculous to rip it up, something that business has been explaining since the minute that we left. I am now being forced out of Parliament by a tiny handful of people. Let's just go back again. The findings of a Conservative majority committee presented to a Conservative majority House of Commons, potentially prompting a by-election in a Conservative majority constituency, is the only path by which Boris Johnson would be removed from Parliament. The idea that he's being forced out by a tiny handful of people is a ridiculous narrative designed to appeal to the stupidest, most blinkered people that, well, have ever been permitted to vote in this country, with no evidence to back up their assertions and without the approval even of Conservative Party members, let alone the wider electorate. Put it to the wider electorate then, Johnson. Put it to the people of Uxbridge and Ruislip. Put it to the House of Commons. Put it to the people. See what result you've run away before that could happen, so that you can claim that you've somehow been betrayed, and if the people had been allowed to cast a vote, they'd have backed you. The only person that has deprived the people of Uxbridge and Ruislip of a vote on your future is you. I believe that a dangerous and unsettling precedent is being set. No, mate, the dangerous and unsettling precedent was set when you and Jacob Rees-Mogg tried to get Owen Paterson off a hook entirely of his own making. And because that went so disastrously wrong, the idea of the Conservative Party now whipping its own MPs to keep you in the Commons was a non-starter from the start. So once again, you're hoisted by your own petard of self-interest and corruption. They tried to save Owen Paterson. It failed. We all thought that was an abject warning in riding roughshod over parliamentary standards. Jacob Rees
Rees-Mogg and Boris Johnson thought it was just a rehearsal. The Conservative Party has the time to recover its mojo and its ambition and to win the next election. I had looked forward to providing enthusiastic support as a backbench MP. Another lie. He's been causing Rishi Sunak problems from the moment he left Downing Street. Harriet Harman's committee has set out to make that objective completely untenable. That is a committee with a Conservative majority and containing 2 ardent Brexiteers that will publish its findings in full for people to read and digest as they please. The only circumstances in which Boris Johnson can claim that he's been badly treated is to get the claim out there before the evidence, before the report. The committee's report is riddled with inaccuracies, he names none, and reeks of prejudice, he cites none. But under their absurd and unjust process, he provides no evidence. I have no formal ability to challenge anything they say. You kind of do, actually. You can challenge what they say when they've said it, and you can tell the members of the House of Commons, you can tell the members of Parliament why they shouldn't vote to send you back to Uxbridge and Ruislip for a by-election. You've got every opportunity to do that. The only person who's deprived you of that opportunity is you. The Privileges Committee is there to protect the privileges of Parliament. That is a very important job. They should not be using their powers, which have only been very recently designed, to mount what is plainly a political hit job on someone they oppose. Pour me another drink. It is in no one's interest, however, that the process the committee has launched should continue for a single day further. So I have today written to my association in Uxbridge and South Ruislip to say that I'm stepping down forthwith and triggering an immediate by-election. I'm very sorry to leave my wonderful constituency. It's been a huge honour to serve them both as mayor and MP. He won that seat, of course, on a promise to resist the building of a third runway at Heathrow. He claimed, of course, that he would lie down in front of a bulldozer to prevent it from happening. But on the day that the House of Commons voted for it to happen, he went on a made-up Foreign Secretary jolly in order to avoid the unseemly optics of him actually voting in favour of a thing he'd promised to oppose. I'm very sorry to do it, but I am proud that after what is cumulatively a 15-year stint, I've helped to deliver, among other things, a vast new railway in the Elizabeth line and full funding for a wonderful new state-of-the-art hospital for Hillingdon, where enabling works have already begun. Is that one of the 40 hospitals that he was still boasting about as he was chased out of Downing Street? I think it probably is. I also remain hugely proud of what we achieved in my time in office as Prime Minister, getting Brexit done. Let's just go back to the same actual letter of resignation. We need to show how we are making the most of Brexit. So have we got it done? Or have we not got it? I mean, is it going well or is it not? Anyway, he's boasting about that. He's boasting inevitably about winning the biggest majority for 40 years without mentioning the lies upon which it was constructed and delivering the fastest vaccine rollout of any major European country. It started the fastest. It was quickly overtaken. And do you know who's in the paper today? Reminding us that he called Boris Johnson grotesque. The actual husband, the former Boris Johnson ally, Jesse Norman, the husband of Kate Bingham, who probably takes more personal responsibility for the success of our vaccine rollout than any other human being in the country. She, well, is presumably too discreet to put her memories on the record, but her husband is happy to. And the word he uses to describe Boris Johnson is grotesque. Another one of the ministers. I also remain hugely proud. He's very sad to be leaving Parliament, at least for now. He can't help himself. That's like hasta la vista, baby. But above all, I am bewildered and appalled that I can be forced out. You weren't. Anti-democratically, it wasn't. By a committee chaired and managed by Harriet Harman, with such egregious bias. And that is the single most pathetic contribution to the public record by a former or sitting Prime Minister that we will hopefully ever have to endure in our lifetimes. I think someone else should speak after the very latest headlines with Thomas Watts. Good grief, is that the time? 10:37, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. How did it happen? How did it happen to our country? How did he happen to our country? That's the question, I think, this morning. If we move on to other matters later, and we may well, I'm drawn perhaps by Rishi Sunak's attempt to stick a Gucci-clad toe on the moral high ground this morning. But listening to that simple analysis of Boris Johnson's resignation letter, drawing very loosely upon things that are in the forefront of my memory. I haven't even dug deep into the catalogue of calumny and corruption that typifies his entire political career, even in his resignation from the House of Commons, a completely cowardly resignation. It's all on display. It's all there. Like the naked emperor. Every dot and squiggle is in plain sight. The lies, the embellishments, the misrepresentations, the bogus victimhood, the stab-in-the-back mythology, the claims that there is some sort of witch hunt, the demonization, the denigration of decent people, the attempt to accuse the others of precisely what it is he does himself. It is so obvious what he is, what he has always been. So obvious that it is perhaps time again to ask how it happened. We've never fully got to the bottom of it. My favourite callers on a morning like this are callers who, like me, fell for it once. Although in my defence, it's 15 years since I fell for it and I came to my senses pretty flipping quickly. But how did this happen? What is it that people were so desperate to believe that Boris Johnson was able to get free pass after free pass after free pass for the most obvious and egregious corruption? A relationship with the truth that was beyond divorce. It was beyond detached. It was as if the two had never inhabited the same space ever. Boris Johnson and the truth, not just strangers, but sworn enemies. And even now, in his resignation letter, even now, he runs through the sort of greatest hits of his own grimness. So how? How did he happen to us? Hit the numbers now, you will get through. And you're probably not surprised to learn I'd quite like to catch my breath. So do ring in a little quicker than usual on 0345 6060 973. Point the finger as well today, if you want. Whose fault is it that you fell for it? Because it's not just his fault. It has to be the fault of people who have spent much of the last 10 years tickling his tummy, people who perhaps were on board with his various appalling examples of misconduct, people who have always given him the benefit of the... I don't know. I mean, how did this happen to us is an overview question, but how did he happen to you? 0345 6060 973 is the number you need, because that wasn't an opinion, what I just did with his resignation letter. That was counting. That was picking over his claims and exposing them to reality. That's what my dad taught me journalism was supposed to do, to speak truth to power, to give the people the information they need to make informed decisions, to be suspicious of the powerful, to give the benefit of the doubt to the people. Boris Johnson's entire life, never mind his political career, represents such a complete subversion of that simple presumption that I wonder how long it will take for normality to be restored. And don't laugh, but there are mornings when I wonder whether we ever had normality in the first place. Johnson has just been so more blatant in his contempt for the public, so more blatant in his contempt for the truth and his contempt for standards than previous politicians, that we've just seen more clearly what goes on. I don't believe that. I just have occasional mornings of thinking that. I don't believe that. I think he is uniquely awful, like Donald Trump. And touch wood, unlike Donald Trump, the succession to Boris Johnson's period of prominence in British politics will not contain people vying to be even more awful than him. I think that we've dodged that particular bullet. 10:42 is the time. Over to you. 0345 6060 973. How did he happen? Hit the numbers now, you will get through. Geraldine's in Leighton to kick things off. Geraldine, what would you like to say?
I think, hi, nice to speak with you. We didn't take the big warning signs. I think we forget that. He shut Parliament. That was before he was voted in, and that was a huge sign. I think when people, because all these people that really wanted Brexit, maybe sometimes you will take things at any price, any cost. So it was such a huge sign, and that was before he got voted. Rees-Mogg lied to the Queen. And the signs were there, and because things don't happen from one day to the other, they happen incrementally. But that was so big. I actually was scared when that happened, because I thought this is extremely dangerous, and I cannot believe the population is walking into somebody who's saying, he was saying to us, I do not care about democracy, I will do what I like. And he still got voted in. So I think we don't look at the signs. That's what I think.
Why did you see that? Because I think even now people don't fully appreciate the awfulness of proroguing Parliament unlawfully.
Maybe because I've read so much about the Second World War.
Okay.
Maybe education, reading. You know, when you read a lot, you get to see what people are like. I mean, I suppose when you read a lot, it gives you the beginning of the story and the end, doesn't it? You see the full you get to see the full picture. So what that helps you to do is when something's happening, you see ahead. And I think that comes from I don't mean education.
You recognise the signs.
University.
No, you recognise the signs. You've got points of reference.
The signs because you've seen the whole picture.
You've got precedents. The thing you remind me of, Geraldine, and I don't think it was necessarily your intention, is that at the time you describe, it was in the heyday of claims that it was all about sovereignty, wasn't it? It was all about so once a lot of what they thought they were going to receive had turned to dust in their hands. People started claiming it was all about sovereignty. It wasn't about wealth. It wasn't about the NHS. It wasn't about immigration. It wasn't about all the things they claimed it was about. It was about sovereignty. And then off went little Jacob to Balmoral to lie to the Queen about the unlawful proroguing of Parliament. So what that does, and I think it's generous to say people didn't understand it, because the alternative is that they actually didn't care. And if they didn't care, then they're essentially owning up to the fact that they were lying about caring about sovereignty in the first place, for two reasons. Number one, we were always sovereign. The House of Commons made that clear in the immediate aftermath. Parliament was always sovereign. And number two, anyone who cared passionately about the sovereignty of Parliament would have been, they'd have been in Oliver Cromwell territory when it came to the unlawful proroguing of the same Parliament. So they're either liars or idiots.
Yeah.
It's hard to guess which. But, welcome to my world. 10:45 is the time. 10:49 is the time, given that even his resignation letter is so easily unpicked as a case study in corruption, dishonesty, self-interest, bogus victimhood and blatant lies, given that it has been so obvious for so long, given that the great Maya Angelou told us all those years ago that when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. How did Boris Johnson happen to us? I wonder also whether I can rephrase that question slightly and say, what did we do to deserve this? 0345 6060973. Sue's at Gatwick. Sue, what do you reckon?
I think he's a grifter that had a compliant client media.
It's got to help, hasn't it?
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, I liked him when he was Mayor of London, but I wasn't living in London.
Right.
I was commuting to London on a regular basis, but he was pulling exactly the same stunts in the London Assembly as he did in Parliament. It was the same level of...
He campaigned on a promise not to close any fire stations or tube stations and then closed loads of fire. I mean, I was a bit slow on the uptake back then, I'm afraid, and I like to think I've made up for it since, Sue, but I remember a terrible person called Brian Coleman, who was the chair of the London Fire Emergency and Planning Authority, and he came barging into the studio one day and started defending Boris Johnson, and then when the microphones went off, he said something like, do you really think Boris doesn't know exactly what's going on? And I remember thinking, I've not done this before. I've never done this weird club where they all think that we're all in it, or all playing on the same pitch. We're all in the same team. And he was essentially telling me, of course he knew he was going to be closing fire stations. And I just remember thinking, blimey, it's rotten to the core, isn't it, this outfit?
It is. And but none of that was appearing in any of the London newspapers, let alone the daily newspapers. What was appearing instead was Boris, the slightly...
The funny guy, the game show host.
Funny guy, the clown.
The ruffle-haired bozo. Yes. But it went on for a very long time. And the scandals, I mean, where do you start, Sue? We could almost play bingo. The recording of him promising to help get a journalist beaten up on behalf of a crook. I mean, it is actually breathtaking. They're getting fired from his first job for making up quotes from his own godfather. Do you think... None
of those were actually pulled together in mainstream media until he was elected as Prime Minister. There were lots of little dribbles, but the little dribbles were hidden on page 14
That's
or 15.
No way to talk about Jacob Rees-Mogg, Sue.
There is that as well, yeah. Or the haunted Victorian pencil, don't get me started.
Hang on. Do you think
you know what Steve Bannon said about Trump and the way that you get away with it is by flooding the zone with excrement. I think sometimes that Johnson has done that unintentionally. He's just so completely encased in egregious behaviour that it's not. I'm not defending the media, but there's so much of it. There's so much of it that you didn't know where to start sometimes.
Yes, but also you had to. There was a lot of it, but you also had to dig for it because it was hidden on page 14 and 15 underneath the adverts for the diapers and stuff.
If they had gone after Boris Johnson for promising to help get a journalist beaten up, for getting fired for making up. I mean, he wasn't Prime Minister when he did those things. So if they'd gone after him for his wrongdoings in office with, shall we say, 10% of the alacrity with which they went after Keir Starmer for having a curry after work in Durham one night, then would this have been over sooner? Would this have been avoided in some part if they'd gone after him before he became Prime Minister, when he was lying about reasons for resigning as Foreign Secretary, being followed by various half-witted acolytes who ended up voting for exactly the thing that they said they were resigning in protest at being asked to vote for when Theresa May was Prime Minister. I don't know. I don't know that you will ever separate Boris Johnson from Brexit, or whether or not anyone will be able to admit the awfulness of Boris Johnson until they can admit the awfulness of Brexit. But you're right. Complicit media, client media, call it what you will. It's breathtaking. It's not that long ago. I used to sit in this studio surrounded by colleagues who thought Boris Johnson was the best thing since sliced bread. And I don't just mean the ones that are related to him. I used to stand out on the LBC schedule like the sorest thumb in the history of thumbs. Incredible, really. Not just on the Brexit front, but on the personal front as well. I don't think his tummy ever got tickled more kindly or fondly than it has been in this studio over the years. But I don't know. I mean, I look forward to finding out what those people feel about what's now transpired. 10:54 is the time. From Sue to Stephen, from Gatwick to Kingston. Stephen, what would you like to say? How did this happen?
Thank you very much for having me on again, James. Good morning. I think that one of the issues is perhaps people not realising, or perhaps being led to a view of believing that there's more to democracy than simply a question of who gets the most votes, as in simple majoritarianism. When in reality, the vote counting bit is just one part of it, and just as important as the rule of law, preservation of institutions that you referred to earlier. And those things are equally important as the vote counting. And the reason why specifically I think in this case that this is an issue is you get to a situation where with Boris Johnson, where someone has clearly ridden roughshod over the institutions, but they can point to their votes and say, well, look at my majority, it must be fine because I got loads of votes. And I feel that is something that the fact that majoritarianism is only one part of democracy should be championed more, so that someone like Boris Johnson can be called out a little bit quicker the next time something like this happens.
I think, yes, and just harking back slightly to Sue, the caller before you, I'm remembering Eddie Mair, of course, making all these points to Boris Johnson's face when he was presenting on the BBC before finding refuge over here. But it is as if you're being lied to by one side and then that side gets a majority of the votes, that's not actually a democratic model, is it? Or rather, it's not a democratic paradigm. It's undemocratic when a liar wins because people liked his lies.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that would be a further point that the debate. But I just think that people like Eddie Mair did champion it, and I'm probably going to go on to the point of talking about client media and other things like that. But it was just so easy because I suppose it's perhaps in the blood of the way we consider democracy. It was so easy just to point to, well, we've got the votes. Yeah, okay, the lies, etc. You could say, but if we had more of a language about understanding institutions, I don't know if it could be an education thing. I mean, I did politics A-level, which is where I got that realisation.
Well, checks and balances and the role of the Fourth Estate, they're quite easy to knit together. I don't think they even need to be separate things. But the attack upon checks and balances is what's underway now. The resignation of 2 ethics advisors, that should have set off bigger alarm bells. The unlawful proroguing of Parliament, that should have set off bigger alarm bells. The pledge to be perfectly comfortable breaking international law in a very limited and specific way, that should have set off. And then, of course, you've got the independent oversight. You've got the House of Lords Appointment Committee, which he overruled. You've
got the security services, which he overruled. I mean, all of the checks and balances that are in place to protect democracy have been denigrated at various times by Boris Johnson in plain sight. We can only imagine the stuff that we don't know about yet. There might be some of it in the Privileges Committee report, which leads me to an unfortunate question, really, which is one I could have asked Sue before you. Why don't people care more? Is your answer simply that they don't know or understand? Because that leaves us in danger of sounding condescending.
No, I don't think that. I think it's just the nature of the way that politics is sometimes talked about. You know, you have the election night is the big thing. That is the huge grandstand, you know, the BBC and their exit polls. Yes. And that very much is seen as being the thing that sets the tone for the next 5 years. Perhaps we just generally don't talk about and celebrate those other institutions enough until they're under attack. And then somebody like you talks about it, and then it's like, oh, well, you know, that journalist says it, but all of the other media organisations are saying something else. So it's perhaps, if it was more part of the national conversation, then we
may have filtered through a little bit more. This is why I come back to the notion that if 10% of the attention had been paid to Boris Johnson's myriad wrongdoings that was paid by corners of the press to Keir Starmer's innocuous curry in Durham, who knows where we might have been. I don't know. And then, of course, you have to remember that Paul Dacre, the editor-in-chief of the publisher of the Daily Mail, and Ted Verity, the editor of the Daily Mail, were both originally on Boris Johnson's honours lists. They weren't on it by the time that the House of Lords Appointment Committee kicked back 8 nominations. 8 nominations. So his final lap, if you like, his lap of honour, his lap of dishonour, his lap of dishonour, contained 8 nominations for peerages that the House of Lords Appointments Committee kicked back, which is what Rishi Sunak is talking about today, saying I wasn't prepared to do something dodgy that he wanted me to do. Well, better late than never, Rishi, I suppose, but only just. We may move on to that element of developments with the Rishi Sunak angle, but there's certainly no diminishment of appetite to continue picking over what I think might be the bones, the carcass of Boris Johnson's political career. The problem always is self-interest. Donald Trump has to run for president because it's his best chance of staying out of jail. He could end up pardoning himself on federal convictions. It's looking incredibly difficult to avoid questions about what this information that he stole from the American people might have had, what value it might have had for other governments. His son-in-law, $2 billion to the good from Saudi Arabia, despite not having displayed any particular aptitude for investment fund managing. But Johnson, if he does come back, it will be solely for egotistical reasons. 3 minutes after 11 is the time. He is perhaps the most selfish human being I have ever met, indifferent to the welfare of anyone save himself. It is striking that he has few, if any, personal friends. He demands loyalty, but is incapable of giving it to others. He has neither principles nor personal convictions, save about his own ambitions and desires. Far from being the genial Mr. Nice Guy he seeks to project, Tony Soprano would find him a tad ruthless. He is a stranger to truth, a lifelong liar about big things and small. Many Brexit supporters today seem willing to pardon him for signing a treaty with Brussels that it was always his intention to break. The world, however, is less forgiving. Britain's reputation has suffered gravely for having chosen a Prime Minister whose words cannot be trusted. I think that's in today's Times. It's by Max Hastings, a former Daily Telegraph editor, when Boris Johnson went to Brussels as a correspondent. So I think it's good to see people. There's a touch of the Pontius Pilates about it, I'm afraid. Isn't there? There's a touch of the hand-washing going on here. It was great for business when he was sending back that Rolex from Brussels about bendy bananas and, I don't know, a ban on cheese and onion flavoured crisps or whatever cobblers it was that he himself described as throwing bricks over the wall and then relishing in the sound of greenhouses glass breaking on the other side. But, you know, there's 2 choices for someone like Max Hastings. Do you disown him and condemn him? Or do you sit on your hands and stay satisfied? I suppose there's 3 choices. Do you stay sycophantic? Do you sit on your hands, or do you start telling the truth? And to Max Hastings' credit, he's been telling the truth for a very long time, albeit without perhaps focusing quite as much as he could have done on his role in Boris Johnson's rise. So how did it happen? Partly because men like that didn't spot his nature, didn't fully appreciate his nature until it was too late. It reminds me of that letter about Farage. Although, obviously, electorally and politically, they're 2 very different creatures. Farage still struggling to beat a man in a dolphin suit in his mainstream political career. Achieved success in elections to a parliament that he wanted to leave. But Johnson, also had a school teacher. They both were spotted by school teachers. I don't like that fully. I've got to be honest with you. I quote both letters in my new book, but I say that you have to give people an opportunity to change. It's one of the things you learn in therapy. It is possible to change. It is possible to be better. If you don't like therapy, think of Jack Nicholson in As Good as It Gets. And he says, is it Holly Hunter's character? You make me want to be a better person. You can try to be a better person. I think it's pretty clear that Boris Johnson never did. So, how did this happen? How did this happen? How did a man whose own boss, editor of the Daily Telegraph, a newspaper that historically has been to Boris Johnson as the Beano has been to Dennis the Menace, incapable, he demands loyalty, is incapable of giving it to others, he has neither principles nor personal convictions save about his own ambitions and desires? I think this programme, possibly more than anywhere else in the British media, is allowed to ask this question. We've been screaming it from the rooftops for over a decade. So how did this happen? 0345 6060 973. Peter is in Poole. Peter, what would you like to say?
I believe it's Parliament's fault.
Go on.
As a whole.
Yeah.
Because if you don't carry out the result of a referendum,
yeah,
it took years to even sign an agreement simply because Parliament couldn't get their head around what they wanted or what it should look like.
Well, no, the reason Theresa May's various attempts failed was down to Boris Johnson and his allies.
I know.
Right, so that's not Parliament's fault, that's Boris Johnson's fault.
Right. But then it was all the infighting.
Well, he was the king of the infighting.
Yes, I totally agree.
He's still doing it now. I don't think you can say the reason why Boris Johnson happened is because of Boris Johnson. I suppose you can, but why are you trying to finger Parliament for it?
Well, because if you look at a simple message,
yeah,
and or the simple fact that it took so long.
Yeah, but that was the problem with Brexit, Peter, wasn't it? Is that 17 million people voted for 17 million different things, and Theresa May ended up with the job of trying to keep them all happy. It was
totally agree with that.
It was never possible.
You've got to understand.
But then you've got
to understand the majority that he got. How many Remainers also voted for him?
I don't know, but keep it focused.
No, well, what I'm saying though is that if you don't carry out a referendum or a mandate,
then
you end up with somebody like Boris Johnson,
right? Because
it's a consequence of not sorting it out quickly enough.
No, it's not, is it? Okay, I think I understand what you're saying, but you've overlooked the fact that what was possible was not desirable and what was desirable was not possible, Peter. So Boris Johnson came along and promised the impossible. That's the only reason he won in 2019.
Yes, and people fell for it.
Pardon?
And people fell for it.
Yes, but they fell for it in 2016 when they voted to leave the European Union on a farrago of lies and misrepresentations.
Same thing, yes. Don't disagree. But if you don't enact what the referendum says, then people will say, well, it's Parliament.
But it wasn't.
Maybe
I think I follow you. But it wasn't so much enacting what the referendum said, because we keep stressing the referendum said millions of different things to millions of different people. Some people wanted fewer brown faces in their local Tesco, and some people thought that we would be able to retain all of the advantages of being in the single market without pursuing any of the responsibilities.
But perception from Parliament was they weren't allowing it. It was that they were trying to stop it.
But that came from Boris Johnson.
Boris came along with a simple message, get Brexit done, and people fell for it.
Yes, okay, all right. So get Brexit done, even though it was them that were going to get done. They put their hands up and marched into the voting booths, marched into the electoral booths. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I just felt that blaming Parliament for it was a little unkind, because essentially it was a small rump of deluded cultists who did for Theresa May and installed Boris Johnson in the leadership office on a lie, and then he took that lie to the entire country and won a general election. So it's not Parliament, it's the fact that Brexit was built on a lie that you're really pointing towards, I think, isn't it? Brexit was impossible.
It's not what Parliament did. It's the perception.
Yeah.
Because
Oh, well, yeah, but the perception was self-protection from the liars. So they had to say, we're being frustrated. It's the same people now who are saying there is a good Brexit, but it goes to a different school, or it hasn't been properly enacted yet, or Brexit has been betrayed. It's like that Faragist wing of ridiculousness, as opposed to Parliament itself. Parliament was a victim of what you describe, and I think that's the point you're making, whereas at the beginning I thought you were essentially describing Parliament as the architect of what you describe. It was the victim. Parliament was, certainly in Theresa May couldn't lie. A far from impressive politician, hideous legacy on Windrush, and her handling of Grenfell was heartbreakingly awful. But she couldn't stand there and lie. She certainly wouldn't stand there and say, we're happy to break international law. So the only way you're ever going to get it over the line was by having a liar-in-chief in place. And, yeah, you're right. I guess Parliament did. Certainly after he got rid of everybody honest in 2019, Parliament became a facilitator-in-chief of lies. 211 Tory MPs, Leicester reminds us, supported him. And that, yeah, I guess is part of the problem. Ivor's in St Helens. Ivor, what would you like to say?
Morning, James.
Hello, Ivor.
I think the how, as we've said numerous times, is the mainstream media. The why is for the implementers of Brexit and the current iteration of the Conservative Party, what serves them best in terms of lack of regulation for their own interests, and for the voters, any of the many reasons that they give different voters. But the honing of the mainstream media goes back to prior to the end of the first Labour government, when Tony Blair was still in office and they were painting Gordon Brown as this vengeful, spiteful person.
Yeah, he was pretty vengeful, and the Daily Mail were pretty nice to Gordon Brown until quite late in the day. Until it all came out at Leveson, the coziness between David Cameron and Rebecca Brooks over at News International was a game changer. And Paul Dacre described Gordon Brown as a friend at one point. I think Gordon Brown denied it subsequently, but I mean, you would, wouldn't you? But he did throw things around. He was a very difficult person to work for and work with. I don't think that was a demonisation necessarily that was invented, as it were.
Unlike, of course, how he is now, as a very intelligent and thoughtful.
It was always that. But power is I mean, you can look at all of them, whether it's Ed Miliband or John Major or whoever it is. Once they're no longer in the leadership position, they are liberated, aren't they? In a way, they become freer. So what Johnson did was sort of cast himself as some sort of saviour when his mission was going to make everything worse.
Well, we had Osborne and Cameron with years of austerity.
I think that's key.
Which was salami slicing most of the essential services for most people.
I think that's crucial, Ivor.
Of course. And they can't then admit responsibility for that. They've got to blame people. So who can they blame? Of course, they can blame the EU, where there is a natural antipathy in the UK, unfortunately.
Immigrants, refugees.
They can blame immigrants. They can blame refugees. Anything,
bureaucrats, unelected bureaucrats.
Of course.
And yet, of course, Nadine Dorries still crying about not getting into the House of Lords. Has spent most of the last years complaining about unelected bureaucrats. I think the number of callers I took, my favourite Brexit callers, were always the ones who sort of said in a slightly bewildered fashion that they just wanted to upset David Cameron in 2016. They just wanted to send a message to Downing Street that they didn't like the direction of traffic, but the same people arguably had put him in Downing Street in the first place, or some of the same people had put him in Downing Street in the first place with an enhanced majority in 2015. But I think without austerity, none of this would have happened. That's my theory. Like Ivor, I don't know that we'd ever be able to prove it, but the denuding of the country that has gone on since 2010 in particular. I don't think there were halcyon days necessarily prior to the financial crisis in 2008, but they were a hell of a lot better than what followed. The denuding, the diminishment, certainly of the public sector, the sense of people who didn't have any financial capital losing their social capital, because social capital is Sure Start centres and libraries and police officers and GP appointments. That's social capital. You might not have much money in the bank, but you have social capital, and this is what they hate. This is what the Tufton Street lot hate. This is what the people who attended that dreadful Nat C conference the other week, this is what they absolutely hate, social capital, because the only sort of capital they care about is capital. So the George Osborne-inspired salami slicing, creating an environment in which someone claiming to be a saviour while simultaneously scapegoating the European Union or immigrants. It's why Farage and Johnson and Trump are of a piece, albeit that one is very much the pound shop version of the other two. 16 minutes after 11 is the time. It's 18 minutes after 11 already. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I've got very slim pickings in Idiot's Corner this morning, which is annoying. We like Idiot's Corner. I presume people will be shouting about Nicola Sturgeon, will they? That's a very interesting story. I don't think Scottish law and English law are the same in these sort of scenarios. I don't think you can be questioned for 8 hours without being arrested. Subsequently, of course, released without charge. But my goodness me, there's so much smoke now surrounding the SNP's finances that it's becoming ever harder to imagine that there might not be any fire. But obviously, you can't say much more than that at the minute. It's a huge news story, big in the bulletin, but not yet a talking point. As soon as it is, we will be on it like a rat up a drain pipe. But I'm not getting much at all. This is definitely categorically not Idiot's Corner, but it's important to remember that people like this are out there. Daniel in Wishaw says, Brexit was good for me as an HGV driver. Brexit caused the driver shortage. I personally got a 33% pay rise. I think it was the only industry where, for workers, there was a plus side. Well, I kind of did pretty well for me as well, Daniel, actually. Although I sense you probably are glad that it happened. I'm still very unhappy that it happened, but in terms of career, solely in terms of career, I think you and me are in a very similar situation. But obviously you will be aware that a large part of the pay rise that you got, or rather the cost of living crisis, has been contributed to by precisely the bonus you got, and a lot of your pay rise will be eaten up by the cost of living crisis. But I get it, and I think it's very important not to have any bones about the fact that some people did get a big boost out of it. At the moment, HGV drivers, as Daniel suggests, being the only obvious ones. 20 minutes after 11 is the time. So how did it happen? And I want to guard against smugness. I know what you're thinking, first time for everything. I want to guard against smugness at this point by suggesting that we all deserved it. We all deserved it because no one did enough to stop it. So how did Boris Johnson happen to us? 03456060973. And what did we do to deserve it? You're not allowed to say we must have been awful in a previous life, but I have occasionally wondered. Kerry's in Windsor. Kerry, what would you like to say?
Yeah, hiya, James. I feel like anybody, I've got my own little list of things that you think have contributed to all of this kind of stuff. In no particular order, the failure of a decent opposition, I think, has got to be front and centre of this kind of thing. I mean, at the very least, there is a centre ground in British politics which has been so noticeably absent with the rise of the populists that, it's just this chasm. How the likes of Ed Davey can be absent without leave.
I'm going to defend Ed Davey. I think you've got a chicken and egg scenario there, Kerry. I think Ed Davey gets all the attention he's offered. I don't know what else he could be doing, personally or professionally.
I think,
we can disagree. I like disagreeing.
It's just that I can't honestly name you that, any real policies that are occupying the centre ground at the moment, for instance, to address any of the major crises that we're facing as a population.
That doesn't explain. That's a grievance that is valid, but it doesn't explain how Boris Johnson happened.
Well, I think a big one there, I'm going to go, it's the failure of the institutions to be able to adapt to a man who is fundamentally going to steamroll with them. I mean, if you want to use any kind of comparison, you go back to somebody like Hitler.
Yes.
Careful. But it's just that you've got these ideas of, it's like the honours list, where they're saying, well, the idea of an honours list is that it's a time-worn institution and the ability to reward a few friends.
Yeah.
But when somebody takes such blatant advantage and the institutions don't move fast enough to be able to say, for instance, the idea that a woman, I'm sure she's a lovely human being, but the idea that somebody who has been a policy advisor to both Truss and Johnson and been in government for 18 months, left university in 2015,
yes,
is now a peer.
The youngest life peer ever. This is, for people not following events, this is Charlotte Owen, who is exactly as Kerry describes her, I'm afraid. I'd normally at this point would say, well, no, hang on a minute. She did do this and she did do that. But she is exactly as you describe her, and she is set to become the youngest life peer ever at the age of 29.
Yeah. And you've got the situation now. I mean, I am so delighted with the parliamentary committee coming back.
Yeah.
It could have been done in a quarter of the time. Let's be honest.
We don't know that. We don't know that. It would have been nice if it could have been. So I like this, because this is where it gets Trumpish, isn't it? In that the system was never equipped to cope with someone prepared to subvert standards so completely.
Yes. And I think then you've got to ally that, obviously. And I hold my hand up here. I'm an ex-journo.
Are you?
I used to work at the BBC. I used to work at Sky.
Okay.
But the abrogation of my former ex-colleagues, I see them on the TV now.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea that Farage was given some airtime.
Still is. He was back on with Laura Kuenssberg. Yeah, sorry, you're referring to that. Even now. It's breathtaking, isn't it?
Yeah.
For balance.
Anybody thinks he has any voice that is representative of anybody but Nigel Farage is... I was absolutely stunned and appalled by that.
Yeah.
But it's, the media owners, they're clearly pulling far more strings behind the background than I was ever aware when I was in a newsroom. I often defend my former colleagues and stuff, and I say, I never really came against an editor who would literally turn around and say, you can't say that or anything else. When I was, I'm one of the old school who just wanted to report the facts as we saw them and present them for the interpretation of others. But then you get back to a little bit, in my mind, to a little bit of what you said earlier on. I can't remember the old quote of, you get the politicians you deserve.
Yeah.
And I think the fact that the public just, they through this huge funnel that came out of Johnson that just said, anything you want to hear, I'll tell you.
And tomorrow I'll tell you the opposite, because you'll want to hear the opposite.
And we never questioned it. We never really took our time as a people to say, hold on a minute, is that doable? And I think we've stepped away from engaging with politics so far that is, up to a certain extent, it's what does the apathy. And there's still this thing of, well, he is who he is, and he sounds quite clever, so I'm sure he's being honest. And that ties into the idea of, surely nobody would be so blatantly dishonest. And
it can't be true, yeah. Well, that's the naked emperor, isn't it, in a way? That's where people can't admit to themselves the evidence of their own eyes and ears. I'd let Sky News off the hook, actually, under your analysis, certainly in its current incarnation, but I'll steer you back...
No, I like Beth Rigby and everything. She's got something about her.
And Jason Farrell and Sophie Ridge, I think they're doing much better work than some of this, and there are still some absolutely superb journalists at the BBC, but the ones who are never attacked by the Daily Mail are probably contributors to the current malaise, I think.
Yeah.
The ones that never get their tweets hauled through, or their history as, Conservative Party activists. There's a 23-year-old lad who got a job at the Beeb not long ago in the social media department, I think. I forget precisely where. Really low-level job. It made national news in 4 or 5 newspapers. And yet, not long ago, Andrew Neil was publishing articles saying that Donald Trump is not going to be as bad as you think. So they've buckled somewhere, their corporation, not deliberately. No one woke up one morning and said, we're going to surrender our role as true arbiters of journalism, but they buckled. See how Emily got treated after she essentially said nothing but the truth about the Barnard Castle debacle, and you'll understand why she's now working on the Newsagents podcast here at Global instead of remaining on Newsnight. And there are still lots of brilliant people on Newsnight and at the BBC, but somewhere in the chain over the last few years, people buckled, they folded. They started worrying more about complaints from Downing Street or monsterings in right-wing media than they did about their responsibilities and telling the truth. Personal reference, briefly, it's not that long ago that I had to step down from there because Boris Johnson, Donald Trump and Brexit struck me as 3 things where the BBC's model of balance or false equivalence was profoundly unhelpful, and my freedom to tell you the truth about all 3 was more important to me than mere career ambitions. Things have turned out all right, I think it's fair to say. 28 minutes after 11 is the time. Andy's in Wickham. Andy, what do you reckon?
I've called in because I'm one of those people that was convinced by the lies.
By him personally?
Well, yeah,
Okay.
effectively, because
Fair
he kind of he led the charge on Brexit. I'm a dad of two young kids, worked in NHS, really, really busy, so would watch the occasional Sky News or ITV News, I used to be on the road a lot, listen to Talk Sports, never really listened to much news, so I was influenced by what I was being told. And the reason I voted to come out was because I felt we were being stifled by Brussels, but actually, as it turns out, they kept us in check because it's unravelled. It's absolutely unravelled. And what's happened, when I didn't have any reason, because I never sort of dig deep enough for the lies in the past, but I had no reason to believe we were being fed lies. Now I question everything.
Yeah.
Absolutely question everything. And I'm now somebody that, and I'm not just saying this because I'm on your radio show, but I tune into you. I like Andrew Marr. I think I've always liked him, and he's become even better since he's come over to LBC.
I agree.
And Carol Vorderman, somebody needs to help her with her platform. I think she's amazing.
Watch this space.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I'm one of those people, and
you're talking about
voted.
trust. You're talking about trust, Andy, and you never question. I mean, because you walk past your newsagent. I do this for a living, and I completely recognise some of the stuff that you've said. It wasn't that long ago. I'd sit there thinking, no, mate, you've gone a bit tinfoil hat. Of course they're not deliberately doing this or deliberately misleading that. Or if they're championing him, he must have some redeeming features. But it's quite liberating to realise that is actually what's been going on, and the Emperor was stark naked all along.
Yeah, absolutely. And now I'm sceptical about absolutely everything. I really am,
Nothing wrong with scepticism, but not to the point of all politicians are awful or they're all as bad as each other.
No,
because
not at all.
that's the only
I
thing
agree.
that saves Johnson now is the idea that they're all as bad as each other, isn't it?
Oh, listen, he stands up there there's a few that stand with him, but the majority are nowhere near him. Him and Trump and the Rees-Moggs and all that, the sooner they're out of politics, the better. It's just they have more than muddied the waters. It's grotesque, and we need to get rid of them. We really, really do, and we need to reset. We really do.
And you remind us that he's still rewarding the grotesque, even as he quits the field, possibly for the last time. Who knows? But he's still rewarding the grotesque, knighting Jacob Rees-Mogg, the liar in chief to the late Queen. Trying to put Nadine Dorries in the House of Lords, the woman who was so detached from comprehending, let alone reflecting reality, that she became a more than a figure of fun. She gets rewarded with television programmes, columns in the Daily Mail, and she believed a seat in the House of Lords, rewarding the grotesque, not just tolerating it, but promoting it. Incredible how useful the nature of his resignation has been. To highlight everything that went before, almost as if he'd given up even pretending. Although he put her in the cabinet, I suppose, so the promotion of the grotesque is nothing new. Thank you, Andy. That's good. I like that a lot. And I think that is the point that we sometimes miss on this programme, is that most people are too busy to be getting into the weeds all the time like we do. Too busy. And also, I'd rather talk about the football than about the politics. So there's that idea that I thought everything was fine. I'll vote for that. I believed this. Doesn't make you a mug, doesn't make you gullible, doesn't make you racist, doesn't make you ignorant. It just makes you busy. I was a bit busy. And that's when what we might call the mainstream media or the media has such a big responsibility to make sure that busy people who don't, quotes, do their own research, end quotes, get the facts or get something like the facts. But my God, if you were relying on the Daily Mail for the facts, then today you'd probably think that Boris Johnson was more sinned against than sinning. And they'll never mention that the editor-in-chief of the publishing company and the editor of the newspaper were both in line for gongs and honours on the original. So Paul Dacre, the editor-in-chief, likes to call himself an enemy of quangocrats. But when Boris Johnson was trying to put him in charge of Ofcom, he was eating peanuts out of Boris Johnson's hand. And then the promise of a seat in the House of Lords is the only thing really that explains why the Daily Mail continues to be so completely detached from reality when so many people rely upon it for reports. It is 11:33. Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines. 11:36 is the time, one of those days, isn't it? I wonder, I thought they might be coming to an end, and then in the last couple of weeks or the last couple of months, they seem to have accelerated pace again. I think a lot of it comes back to Suella Braverman, oddly. I did naively, more in hope than expectation, think that Sunak was worth at least giving the benefit of the doubt to when he pledged, within moments of becoming Prime Minister, he pledged to focus on professionalism, accountability and integrity. And for 6 hours, we all sort of gave him the benefit of the doubt. And then he put Suella Braverman back in the Home Office, which means his claim to any form of moral high ground was essentially done before it was even begun. And he's back claiming the moral high ground today. We'll have a look at that shortly and wonder what this means for him. I think that the rebellion has failed. I mean, you wouldn't rely entirely on The Guardian for this, although their political reporting is exceptional. Senior Tories tell Johnson to shut up and go away, which reminds me, we haven't heard from Gavin Williamson for a while, have we? And this is the suggestion that the client media at the weekend suggesting that there was about to be a big rebellion and there was going to be an orchestrated campaign of resignations, and little Farage popped up on the telly claiming that there were going to be lots of defections to whatever party it is that he's currently involved with. But it would seem that the immediate threat of some sort of rebellion is receding. I guess you would have heard probably by today, or certainly over the weekend, people following the actions of Friday. And you can tell how desperate the Daily Mail are. Their front page today, Suella, Keir is in the pocket of the eco-mob. So Suella Braverman's been on the phone to the Daily Mail trying to secure a front page because she knows that they wouldn't want to be writing about the travails of the man that they did more than any other organ in the United Kingdom to propel all the way to Downing Street. End of an era in UK politics. Sturgeon arrested, Johnson out in cold. Nicola Sturgeon has described her arrest as a shock and deeply distressing. She continues to deny all wrongdoing. Incredibly, it means that Humza Yousaf, the First Minister, is the only First Minister in the history of the office not to have been arrested at some point in their life. I mean, that is pretty grim, albeit, as I say, released without charge, and we'll keep an eye on that story. 11:38 is the time. The question of how did this happen, and I mean specifically Boris Johnson, the unique nature of his corruption, being allowed to rise all the way to the top of the United Kingdom, to the very highest office in the land. Some of the obvious culprits have already been named. If you've got something a little subtler, if I picked a favourite, I think we spend so long banging on about the media on this programme, and much of my new book is about it. But the failure of the institutions is huge. The failure of the institutions, but failure makes it sound like it might be their fault. It was the rubbishing, the undermining of the institution. The way that someone like Rees-Mogg would, with that ludicrously affected accent of his, pretend that he was some sort of parliamentary historian, pretend that he was some sort of upholder of parliamentary tradition, when he did more than almost anybody else in Boris Johnson's governments to set fire to it. He was the, quotes, mastermind, end quotes, behind the Save Owen Paterson campaign. It was at his behest that they sought to rip up the rule book after Owen Paterson was found to have broken the rules. He was the one sent to Scotland to lie to the Queen about the unlawful prorogation of Parliament. But that's the deference. We haven't mentioned deference yet. So deference gets a place on the list. The way that Johnson pretended, just as Rees-Mogg pretends, to be some sort of aristocrat, to be to the manner born, secure in the knowledge that swathes of the British public will bend the knee, will doff the cap, will tug the forelock. They can't be massive, massive liars because they're posh. And the posh people are the ruling class. They're born to rule. The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate. In the same way that people think Donald Trump's wealth must mean that he is possessed of some sort of skills or integrity, so it is with the faux toff status of Rees-Mogg and Johnson, who, especially in Rees-Mogg's case, will have decided at a very early age to start talking like that because he ended up posher than the Queen. That doesn't happen by accident, and it certainly doesn't happen just by dint of going to Eton. If you need proof of that, listen to how Prince William talks, or Prince Harry. Rees-Mogg thinks he's posher than them. So deference was part of it, but the trashing of the willingness to completely trash institutions, and we should have spotted that really early, really, really early, probably with the Priti Patel bullying. And some of us did, but the people whose job it is to point this stuff out failed, and failed again. Nick's in Wrexham. Nick, what made you pick up the phone?
I love what you just said about the people whose job is to point it out. They didn't do it because that's why I'm calling it about. I think that the media have displayed Jeremy Corbyn to be the model equivalent of Boris Johnson, and that's how we ended up with that majority that Boris Johnson gets. Not just Jeremy Corbyn, but anybody on the left.
Yes.
And an example I'd give you would be obviously Mojito Gate with Diane Abbott.
on the train.
And getting her sums wrong on LBC against somebody like Dominic Raab, who has been kind of called a bully, or Priti Patel. And I feel like Diane Abbott was demonised far, far more for that than what they were.
Yes.
Jeremy Corbyn was presented as just as deeply unethical as Boris Johnson, and for my money, there's no way in the world. There's absolutely no way in the world, and it's simply because he's left wing.
I mean, we will disagree about that, but we don't need to get into the weeds about it. The man was manifestly unelectable, and pointing that out was not. It didn't cause it, if you see what I mean. I mean, we'll get into this a little bit. How much of Jeremy Corbyn's epic failure electorally do you think was Jeremy Corbyn's fault, just personally?
Oh yeah, I do blame him. I do, because I think it was Brexit.
Because an awful lot of people don't. An awful lot of people seem to think it was my fault.
Well, see, James, I understand that. I do, because...
Mate, I've got 1.4 million listeners. You need to win about 14 million votes to get over a general election result. But pointing out the unelectability of someone doesn't make them unelectable. So how much, on a percentage term, how much of his epic electoral failure was his fault, do you think?
I wouldn't say percentage, I don't know, but I will blame him because, as I say, Brexit, instead of... picking a side, he tried to be the bridge. He tried to sort of bring the sides together.
He didn't do that. He was obviously a leaver. Diane Abbott has admitted it subsequently, so we can abandon the idea that he was trying to build some sort of bridge. And if, as I did, you spoke to voters in the run-up to the 2019 election, they'd have told you that his apparent prioritisation of the concerns of Patagonian llama farmers over the experiences of people in Wrexham was another reason why they weren't going to vote for him. But hey-ho, let's all shoot the messenger.
No, I get what you're saying, but as I say, he says he voted Remain, and I believe him.
I don't.
Well, I mean, there's no precedent of him lying. I've not seen anything, to prove of him being a liar, more being lied about in the media. They were like, for example, like him and Seamus Milne being called Putin's puppets, and that sort of thing.
Well, we need to look up Seamus Milne's relationship with the Kremlin. Well, you need to have a proper look at that. And we're getting a little bit distracted. So how did Boris Johnson happen? Failure of opposition, but you will quibble over how much of the failure of the opposition was the opposition's fault and how much of it was the fault of the media. And you're right to do so, because they can malign Ed Miliband's dead dad. Then goodness knows what they can do with a living leader of the opposition. But I'm afraid the idea that he was exposed to excessive or exceptional abuse by the right-wing media is crackers. Do you know I never met a Conservative politician or a Conservative supporting journalist that wanted Jeremy Corbyn to leave the leadership of the Labour Party?
Yeah, I get that. I do.
Really focus on it, mate, because that is the single most important element of this conversation. There was not a single Tory MP. They would love to be going into the next election against Jeremy Corbyn. If you don't believe me, just ask them.
Well, that's because, as I said, they won the last one. I do think it might have been different if there wasn't Brexit, but, there you go.
If they'd had an election... Well, you can, but hopefully it's a little bit more on topic
Corbyn
so far.
No. For
Keir
example,
Starmer against Corbyn as an answer to the question of how Boris Johnson happened. Good luck with that, Nick.
No. What I'm saying is that the way the media portray it.
Yes.
So Corbyn was portrayed differently. So, for example, how Keir Starmer is. Keir Starmer gets it far more favourable. I know you'll point to Currygate. And say
not just Currygate, but you remember when he sold a field that had been bought so that his disabled mother, could keep an eye on the donkeys she looked after,
how long ago was that?
That was held up as evidence of how awful he was. The appointment of Sue Gray, it's even in Boris Johnson's resignation statement.
How long ago was? Yeah, but then this was on a weekly basis with Corbyn.
You had the BBC in the run-up to a general election. Nick. No. This is pathetic, mate. I don't want to fall out with you. It's 2023. It's 2023. When are you going to start looking at the road ahead instead of doing the violins for the road behind?
Well, your question is to ask how
my
we got
question
Johnson,
to you
which was elected
now.
in 2019.
My question to you now. No. Johnson was Prime Minister until a few months ago. So I'll ask you again because I think it's.
But he was elected in 2019.
I think it's significant that
so
you
we
can't.
have to look at the.
Well, yes, okay. How much of Jeremy Corbyn's epic electoral failure do you think was Jeremy Corbyn's fault?
Well, I have to blame him, or him and him.
No, but
alone.
how much? How much? 52%, 48% more sinned against than sinning? 60%, 70%? Because I can give you a number. I'll give you a number now, 95.
Yeah, okay. Well,
what's yours?
As I say, I'm not going to put a number. I'm not going to put a number
Why
on
not,
it,
though?
as I say.
It's really interesting to me. I'd love to know how much of Jeremy Corbyn's epic electoral failure, historic electoral failure, tragic, catastrophic electoral failure, how much of it you think was Jeremy Corbyn's fault and how much you think was everybody else's?
I would, yeah. Okay, go on, then I'll give you 70%.
Okay, well, that's not bad. I salute your honesty. If I was Bruce Forsyth, I'd shout higher, 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 but that would be childish. It's 11:47. It's 11:51 and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. How did Boris Johnson happen? What did we do to deserve him? We should put the failure of opposition on the list, indeed in 2019, to go back to the last caller, and then we can argue forever about whether or not the failure of the opposition was the fault of the opposition or the fault of somebody else, but not standing up, not making a case, not pointing out the lies. I don't know whether it would have made much difference, to be honest, but it would have been nice at least to try. 11:51 is the time. Vanessa is in Wokingham. Vanessa, what would you like to say?
Hi, good morning, James.
Hello.
Big fan, and thank you for being a light through all this mess.
I've tried, Vanessa.
Well, no, come on. You're the only real, don't Sheila and others, but you are our leading
Anyway, on
light.
we go. You know how
on we
it
go.
goes.
I think it's a little bit more sort of esoteric, if you like, a little bit more mystical. I think that Johnson actually cast a kind of spell over the country with his seducing language, his boosterism. It was almost like he could take us back to a time when, the country was great. And I told you, I think the person who encapsulated that the most was an article that A.A. Gill wrote during the In Out campaign. And can I read a little bit?
Yes, you can. I can listen to A.A. Gill till the cows come home, actually.
So he was at Question Time. He heard this woman who cried under stress. I want my country back. And it was almost like a siren, a wail. And he said, he wrote, we all know what they mean. They mean back from Johnny Foreigner, back from the brink, back from the future, back to busky hedges and dry stone walls and country lanes and church bells and warm beer and skittles and football rattles and cheery banter and clogs on cobbles.
Yeah.
We all know what getting our country back means. It's a snorting a line of the most pernicious and debilitating little English drug, nostalgia. The warm, crumbly, honey-coloured collective yesterday, which believed that everything was better back then. And I think that's what, Johnson, his Etonian accent, his floppy hair,
this is where you put me in the odd position of having to, I don't know if this counts as bigging him up or defending him, but Farage got there first, didn't he? I mean,
Farage, yes, I suppose so, but Farage would never.
Well, he couldn't beat a dolphin. He couldn't beat a dolphin, could he, in an actual by-election?
And I mean, we all know now that the only reason Johnson did what he did because he wrote that letter and having two different...
It was personal ambition.
Yes, it was personal ambition, it was power, it was what he always wanted.
So he'd be knocking out the pernicious lines for other people to snort, but equally, if he thought it would serve him better, he'd be knocking out the opposite. Wouldn't he? He'd be selling the precise opposite. He'd be pointing out the hypocrisy of this sort of nostalgia fetishisation.
You think so, but I think that the country, because of austerity, because of, the crash, because of everything that was bad, he was like a glimmer of hope of things better that we could achieve in the future again. I mean, how many times on the street when I would say to people, look, there may be shortages of medicines, of food, that will never happen. This is England. And you know, they were so stuck in that belief. Now,
but I feel no anger towards them. I was a bit like that, you know, not so much after it happened and I came to a better understanding of some of the complications. But before, I just thought, no, don't be stupid. There's no way that our actual supermarket shelves are going to be affected by this kind of thing.
Well, no, but I don't think we ever thought it would get that bad. But, you know, it did. But I do believe that, I mean, I have very, very intelligent friends who were led down that garden path, you know, how things... And I think a lot of the older voters definitely sort of were seduced by that language at a time that...
Yeah, there's two things. You're right, there's two things going on there. There's the nostalgia that A.A. Gill described, and then there is, I wouldn't even have called it exceptionalism at the time, just a sort of complacency that all right, there might be some...
Oh, I don't agree with you.
Okay.
I think there was... Because, you know, I mean, I'm Anglo-Indian and I've lived in this country all my life. It's my home and my language and everything. But people that I knew from primary school were just saying to me, "Man, you don't understand. You're not English."
Oh, wow.
You know, and
okay.
I know. And you know, that hurt so much because I understood and I could look at them and say, but you don't know what you're doing. You know, this is not going to be good. But they were so seduced by... And I think Johnson had apparently, you know, when you stand close to him, he has some kind of charisma that you just get drawn into. I don't know what he gives off, but whether it's his own self-belief, but he just draws people in and they become...
He's quick-witted. He's quick-witted and funny, and he does draw you in and charm you. It's a sort of... It's a bit like the back of the bus at school, and you know, they seem to be having more fun back there. So we'll go. Hopefully, you'll be able to go and sit with them. You make some great points. Actually, we've forgotten that kind of fetishization of what nostalgia and weaponization of nationalism. I suppose you'd describe it as. Speaking of nationalism from a very different perspective, I think I may have misspoken earlier. I was pointing out that Nicola Sturgeon's arrest makes her the second SNP First Minister, former SNP First Minister, to be arrested. I think I said that. The first, that means the only one who's never been arrested is the current one, but not mentioning the SNP. Obviously, Donald Dewar and others. There have been other first ministers who have never been arrested, but Hamza Yousaf is the only SNP first minister, present or former, who's never been arrested. SNP being a crucial, SNP FM being a crucial part of that. But I've had 2 or 3 people pointing it out, which makes me think that I probably did misspeak. And just so you know, because I think most people have got no idea that this goes on. I think perfectly reasonably that the mention of Jeremy Corbyn earlier, it gets astonishing responses still. I'll just give you a flavour of it. The epic failure of Jeremy Corbyn was down to the Telegraph, the Guardian, and mostly the Israeli government and the Jewish Chronicle. And if you can't admit that, then you are part of it. That's the mindset I'm referring to when I talk about, or I wonder how much of his failure do you think was down to him. That right there. And I'll now get a couple of dozen of these in my inbox in the next 10 minutes or so, which serves me right, really, for complaining about how empty Idiot's Corner was an hour ago. It is 11:57 and Richard is in Manningtree. You'll have to be quick, Richard, but I know you can rise to the challenge.
Nice one, James. Thanks for having my call.
You're welcome.
It's a morbid point, but I think we have to take more personal responsibility.
Yes.
I think that is the number one reason why Boris was able to survive as long as he did. And I know you were just on the topic of Jeremy Corbyn and some people saying, well, it should have been a stronger opposition. And yeah, it should have been a stronger opposition, but
I don't know how much difference it would have made. I mean, no. It's a counterfactual, but the juggernaut was already out of control, I think, by then.
And talking about out of control, when I was a child, I had an obsession with fire.
Oh, yeah.
So I always, we sometimes had candles in the house. And like when I was young, I always wanted to touch the flame. I always wanted to touch the candles. And my dad, I remember my dad would always tell me off. He'd say, don't do it. You're going to burn yourself. You're going to burn yourself. Don't do it. In the end, I didn't listen and I ended up touching the flame. And I did burn myself. And, I never touched it again. And so why, as a British public, do we continue...
We kept going back for more, didn't we? Touching it again and again and again.
And that's why I say, look, it's ultimately, for me, it's down to the personal responsibility. We've seen all the things that he's done. I started listening to you during the prorogation of Parliament.
Oh, yeah.
And I haven't really stopped listening since. And the lady said a couple of times before, thank you for continuing to shine the light on this because...
Well, do you think I can stop now?
until it's 100% dead and buried, because there is the slight chance that he still tried to do something
like
else.
Nosferatu, unless someone finds that metaphorical stake to drive through his heart. He certainly he put for now, even in his resignation letter, he can't help himself. That's very kind of you to say so. It really is, and there are plenty of other people. I mean, I sit at the feet of Eddie Mayer and other brilliant journalists when it comes to my own efforts. But yeah, I mean, there were times, I think, you'll allow us to say, there were times when it did feel like we were a pretty lonely outpost on those three issues. I mean, Boris Johnson's dominating the agenda today with a side order of Brexit, but don't forget, Donald Trump was getting cheered. In fact, there's another one, Andrea Jenkyns. He's given her a damehood, hasn't she? And she's the one who is known chiefly for making an obscene gesture towards protesters, peaceful protesters, and her support for Donald Trump. So that's a damehood for her off Boris Johnson. It's a very odd list, that, isn't it? Priti Patel, Andrea Jenkyns, Charlotte Owen, Nadine Dorries. It's actually quite hard to pin down what they might have in common, apart from, I don't know enough about her to say. It's 3 minutes after 12 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Slight change of pace now. We stay very much in the weeds of modern political developments, and unfortunately, Boris Johnson still very much setting the tone, setting the narrative, which must annoy Rishi Sunak enormously. It's very naive to think that you can pursue a career in politics without having at times to maintain friendly relations with colleagues that you despise or find ridiculous. I think that is one thing you can say with some confidence about both major parties. I don't know about, and even the SNP, well, the SNP is a major party, of course, but I'm just looking at the last leadership battle, and the SNP got pretty nasty, didn't it? And I noticed that the defeated candidate is claiming that having religious faith can be a problem in politics, which will no doubt come as enormous news to Sadiq Khan and Humza Yousaf, not to mention that well-known Catholic and upholder of Christian values, Jacob Rees-Mogg. But hey-ho, on we go. I mention that because it's not fair entirely to say that Rishi Sunak can't have the moral high ground because he was Boris Johnson's Chancellor. It's a bit like you turn it the other way around and you accuse Keir Starmer of being disingenuous because he served in Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet. You can't. I mean, there is guilt by association, but it is ridiculous to suggest that if you find yourself in a cabinet or a shadow cabinet led by someone you find pretty repellent or ridiculous, then you should resign and really sacrifice your own career upon the altar of their awfulness. You can do it, and people do, of course, but usually on very specific and clear points of principle. So usually on Heseltine resigned on principle. That notion that you can... also all the ones that walked away, of course, and set up their own party, which didn't go well, but it might have done. The SDP went rather better for a long time. So Shirley Williams and Bill Rogers and David Owen and Roy Jenkins. So there are... Do you see what I mean? I think it is unfair to expect everybody who ends up working for a person they don't respect very much to resign. And I say that about Rishi Sunak, and I oddly would say it about Keir Starmer as well. I think that... But here is a bid for the moral high ground. I'm going to play it to you in full, and then I'm going to ask you a very simple question, which is this. Does he have a leg to stand on? And then I'll ask you a slightly more complicated question, which is this. Do you think he'll ever be able to distance himself from Boris Johnson? And again, people who perhaps felt a little excluded by the first 2 hours of the programme by dint of still being under Boris Johnson's spell or more likely perhaps still being very much a Conservative, big C or small c, and thankful perhaps that this man has now quit the field. Does Sunak, is he tainted? 03 by association with Johnson. I'll take those calls. In fact, you can get in early on that before I've even played it to you. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. But have a listen to this. I think this is really interesting for a number of reasons.
When it comes to honours and Boris Johnson, Boris Johnson asked me to do something that I wasn't prepared to do because I didn't think it was right. That was to either overrule the HOLAC committee or to make promises with people. Now, I wasn't prepared to do that. As I said, I didn't think it was right. And if people don't like that, then tough. When I got this job, Yeah, when I got this job, I said I was going to do things differently because I wanted to change politics. And that's what I'm doing.
I didn't know he got applauded. I only heard the bit in the bulletin. It was a tech sort of meeting, so it'd be interesting to know who clapped him. Did you hear, I don't normally mention the opposition, but did you hear any questions on Radio 4 at the weekend? I've only heard the clip, but they had breaking news. They never normally do breaking news because it's a pre-record. But they announced Johnson's resignation, and the audience broke out into spontaneous applause and cheering, which I thought was remarkable, really, given the nature of many BBC audiences for programmes like that. There's one coming up where you can't be in the studio unless you actually voted for Brexit, which is an interesting experiment that I look forward to having a look at. Just looking at this, Peter Cruddas, do you remember him? He's now Lord Cruddas. I think he's one of the architects of one of these mad new parties or movements called something like Boris is brilliant and everyone who hates him should shut up and go away, or words to that. I forget the exact title of the party. So he's in the House of Lords. And the House of Lords Appointment Commission said that he shouldn't be. They recommended that the businessman, who's only donated £3.5 million to the Tories over the years, so I'm sure it's got nothing like that, they recommended that Peter Cruddas shouldn't be elevated to the upper chamber. Why wouldn't they want him to be elevated to the upper chamber? He was accused by the Sunday Times in 2012 of charging people to meet the then Prime Minister David Cameron and his Chancellor George Osborne. This when he was Tory party treasurer. He did actually sue the newspaper for libel over those allegations and won £180,000 in 2013, but that figure was later significantly reduced after a Court of Appeal judgment in 2015 found the central allegation was borne out by the facts and aspects of his conduct had been unacceptable and wrong. I must get this right for legal reasons. However, it upheld the ruling that the other allegations in the original article were still false and defamatory, and he was allowed to keep 50 grand of the original 180 grand in damages. So the House of Lords Appointment Commission said no to that, and yet he's in the House of Lords. And I think that was in 2020? Was Sunak Chancellor in 2020? It's so hard to keep up. So presumably Rishi Sunak has got a big problem with Peter Cruddas being in the House of Lords, given that appointment was made against the advice of the House of Lords Appointment Commission. Because the thing that Sunak is referring to here, and I'll play it to you again, the thing that he is referring to here is Johnson's request that he ignore the House of Lords Appointment Commission when making appointments to the House of Lords on two fronts. There is the unsuitability of some candidates, including the bloke, and it's amazing what you forget, including do you remember that holiday on Mystique that we never got to, or that holiday do you remember that holiday there? Did we ever find out who paid for that? Because the bloke that they claimed had paid for it then came out and said he hadn't paid for it, but he had played some sort of role in organising it. So he was going to get a seat in the House of Lords. I think he founded Carphone Warehouse. He was going to get so that's part of the thing that Johnson requested from Sunak. And the other bit was a sort of special VIP lane. You'd think they'd have learned their lesson about VIP lanes, wouldn't you? A special VIP lane for Nadine Dorries. So she would be able to accept a peerage but not leave the House of Commons until the next election, at which point she could step down from the House of Commons and just waltz effortlessly into the House of Lords. An interesting journey for a sworn enemy of unelected bureaucrats or indeed unelected officials, unelected politicians, which she's railed against for much of her pathetic career, but now apparently is desperate to become one. I did hear an interview with her at the weekend where she said, it's because I was very poor when I was a child. It'd be great if I was in the House of Lords because it would send such a wonderful message to poor children. This is a woman who sits on the same benches as Lee Anderson, of course, who claims that poor children are merely victims of their own parents' fecklessness and irresponsibility, just as their leader and her hero, Boris Johnson, needed £800,000 in loans secured by a distant relative and facilitated by a bloke he then put in charge of the BBC simply to keep his own finances above the waterline. But hey-ho, we're getting distracted again. So what Sunak is referring to here is Boris Johnson's request that he ignore the House of Lords Appointment Committee, just as Boris Johnson himself ignored the House of Lords Appointment Committee when he put Peter Cruddas in the House of Commons. He also reportedly ignored the security services when he put Evgeny Lebedev in the House of Lords, the son of a man who's subsequently being sanctioned by Ukraine and Canada, among others, as a key member of Vladimir Putin's inner circle. And that, of course, is the bloke that Boris Johnson was partying with on the night of his own election. Here is Sunak this morning, and this is what we'll be talking about for the next hour, so pay attention.
When it comes to honours and Boris Johnson, Boris Johnson asked me to do something that I wasn't prepared to do because I didn't think it was right. That was to either overrule the Whole Act Committee or to make promises with people. Now, I wasn't prepared to do that. As I said, I didn't think it was right. And if people don't like that, then tough. When I got this job, when I got this job, I said I was going to do things differently because I wanted to change politics. And that's what I'm doing.
I just found that really interesting because you almost wanted to go, ooh, what do you mean? If people don't like that, well then, tough. Ooh, get you, Rishi. Mr. Tuffy thinks he's Tyson Fury. I just thought that was lovely. And if it wasn't for the fact, of course, that he'd put Suella Braverman back in the cabinet 6 hours after promising to bring back professionalism, accountability and integrity, I might be having one of my temporary moments of excessive optimism and thinking that he does mark a departure from what went before. But that was the right call, okay? And I believe him. I think he has turned around and said, presumably, with threats on the table, if you don't do this for me, nice, this is Johnson, by the way, nice little prime ministership you got going on there. Be a shame if something happened to it. Now, there are two reasons why Sunak shouldn't respond to that by doing what Johnson wants. Number one, it would be an absence of integrity. It would be dishonest. But number two is if Johnson promises that he's not going to cause you any bother in the future if you give him what he wants now, it's not worth the paper it's printed on, that promise. He'll do whatever the hell he wants, whenever the hell he wants to, regardless of what he promised you yesterday, as anyone who's ever come into contact with him can tell you. So it was a round of applause. I don't know how big the room was. I mean, it certainly wasn't a standing ovation, but it was a round of applause, someone questioning my description of what they just heard. So I want to know, listening to that, whether, because this is a crucial question for Rishi Sunak, it might in fact be the most important question of all, is can he detach himself from Boris Johnson? That's the first really big attempt to do so. I thought the professionalism and accountability and integrity comments on the steps of Downing Street were, but then he put Braverman back in the Home Office, so he completely torched any claim to the moral high ground in that moment. Here's another claim to the moral high ground. Is it more persuasive? He's there. He's given it some. Yeah, tough. That's just tough. That's hard cheese. I bet he got talked out of saying hard cheese. I bet he wanted to say hard cheese. If you don't like it, that's hard cheese, tough cheddar. So there is Sunak. Number one, has he got a leg to stand on when he sort of bids for the moral high ground like that? And number two, is he going to be able to separate himself from the legacy of Boris Johnson? For the record, I'd put that at 52-48. I think he might be able to. And I think Conservative voters will be particularly keen to believe that he can. And by believing that he can, of course, they might help him to do so. So hit the numbers now. You will get through. 0345 6060 973. Does he have a leg to stand on when saying, I'm not going to do what Boris Johnson wanted because of principles? And can he detach himself from, can he wash off the stench of Johnson with which he remains, I think, surrounded? It's 12:16. 12:18 is the time. Can he distance himself from Boris Johnson? He hasn't managed to yet, but I think the efforts will start in earnest now. And when Rishi Sunak appeals to principle, as he has done this morning, somewhat unexpectedly, I think, does he have a leg to stand on, given his own track record, both within and without Boris Johnson's cabinets? Imisalua is in Fulham. Sorry to keep you waiting, Imisalua. What did you want to say? Can you remember? Can you remember what you want to say?
I'm trying. Excellent. It's been a while. So I don't think he has a leg to stand on, and I really don't think he's going to remove himself from the centre of Boris Johnson. I think when you lie with dogs, you get fleas, and you made the decision to lie with dogs enough to get yourself into the right position for you. Yeah. And now that no longer serves you. Now you want to turn around and say, oh, on the basis of principle, I couldn't do this. Yes. It just doesn't work. On the basis of principle, you should have left that government a very long time ago when it was very clear that Boris Johnson was not anybody who should be in power. In fact, did anybody?
Well, I mean, until the final exodus, when there was enough momentum to actually get him out of the Downing Street door, did anybody ever object on principle, resign on principle? They must have.
No, nobody did, because as you said, this government isn't one that plays by previous rules. Nobody resigns on principle. So you've now decided that the backlash from the honours list is so much that you're actually having to come out and say, actually, Boris came and asked me and I said no, look at me, clap for me because I said no.
Yeah.
Okay, your job is to say no. Like, I'm tired of the mediocrity. I'm tired of applause for mediocrity. That's what I'm tired of. I'm tired
Javid went, hang on. No,
doing the basics.
Sorry, I'm interrupting you and you're in full flow. Carry on. Tired of the mediocrity.
Yeah, I'm tired of people being congratulated for doing mediocre things. But you want to be... it's like, do you want us to tell you that you've done well because your former boss, who everybody knew was morally corrupt, told you to do something that was morally corrupt and you said no? But everything else that he told you to do was morally corrupt, you were happy to do as long as it served your interest. It no longer serves your interest. So now you want to come and tell us, by the way, he told me to do this and I said no.
Yeah, but you can't. I mean, if you're Chancellor of the Exchequer, you either go along with it or you walk away. And you couldn't necessarily point at anything from which he should have walked away. Well, except maybe the appointment of Peter Cruddas, I suppose.
The appointment of Peter Cruddas, but I think in general, Boris Johnson's track record didn't show a multitude of places where he'd been like a stand-up guy. So by joining his government, by taking a cabinet position in the first place, you kind of knew that this wasn't really going to be a government that was similar to governments that we've had before. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's not necessarily that we could all point out, okay, he did this, he did this, he did this. For me, the fact that you were in that government at all is enough for me.
I'm going to disagree. I'm going to disagree with you on that. But it doesn't mean either one. That's why I'm only 48% on this, because you're saying that nobody who served with Boris Johnson can ever be rehabilitated.
It's too close. For me, it's too close.
No, fair enough.
Too close.
Fair enough. I mean, in which case, it's not really a conversation about Rishi Sunak. I mentioned Sajid Javid because I was about to remind you he did actually resign on principle. He refused to dismiss his advisors, didn't he, in 2020? And that's why he walked, which is how Rishi Sunak got into Downing Street in the first place, got into number 11 Downing Street in the first place. So that might count. I think Johnny Mercer did something that was principled when he resigned, but then he came back again later. And Jake Berry, of all people, because he was really sucking up at the weekend, refused to accept a new position during the 2020 cabinet reshuffle. So, yeah, OK, so because Johnson was so awful, anybody who sat by or cooperated with him is tainted forevermore.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised we disagree on this.
Well, I'm about to quote King Lear. I'm about to say, so young and so untender in Mr. Lua. And I think you've probably answered the implicit question as well, which is are there any circumstances in which you could cast a vote for the Conservative Party in a general election?
No. I mean, I've never been a Conservative voter. I've always been a Labour voter, but I couldn't vote for this Conservative. I had more respect for previous Conservative governments.
What if he'd come in, talked about professionalism, accountability and integrity, and then actually pursued that properly from the get-go?
If he pursued it, yes, but you didn't. You have to do Braverman in your government.
Yeah, so it's too late. So I'm just trying to talk you down from the position that absolutely everybody, because that, you even bring in your Tom Tuggan hats. Anybody at all who drank from the chalice is poisoned forever. And I don't think that's fair, because it would be feasible to make the same claims, of course, about Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet, and to claim that anybody who had served with him or sat alongside him was somehow tainted forevermore. I don't know. I just think it's a bleak landscape for the next decade of British politics. But it doesn't mean you're wrong. You may well be right. It's potential Tory voters who perhaps are going to be more interesting in these contexts than anybody else, because you had enough of Johnson, but Sunak, in some way, you're desperate for him to represent a fresh start. I just wonder whether that freshness, the freshness of that start, was held below the waterline the minute he put Braverman back in the Home Office. I don't know. Mohammed's in Birmingham. Mohammed, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Yeah, I'm a new listener to LBC, having left the BBC about 2 weeks ago, to be honest with you. I'm fed up of them. So
well, better late than never, Mohammed. Welcome aboard.
Indoors. Yeah,
Welcome
better
aboard.
late than never. A lot of sympathy with what your previous caller said, but I think, my view is you can't take an absolutist view, and politics is about compromise. It really did stink when Sunak put Braverman back in, but that was political expediency. He needed the votes of her backers, and so he made a decision which will haunt him. But going forward, I do think, having now considered that I might rejoin and become a member again of the Conservative Party, having quit when Johnson became leader, because I refused to pay my dues to a party that would have somebody like him as a leader. I do think he's got, one leg, but a shaky foundation on which he's standing.
Okay. Yeah, well, it's better than not to labour the analogy, but it's better than no legs.
Yeah. And I just think, this whole country, this entire sort of party, country, everyone, millions of people who voted have just been through the ringer, through the cult of Johnson so much, which has been thoroughly embarrassing in this country, as it has been for people in America. Yeah. It's just going to take time to wash that filth off, and Johnson's going to continue lobbing his grenades because that's all he does, because he's a worse than child with whose lollipop you've taken away. And, I do hope that, Sunak does more of what he did today, frankly. So I think that's what's been lacking.
Okay. Yeah, I'm possibly closer to you than I am to Imisalua. I don't know, and I'm not sure it matters whether it's authentic or not, because it's politics.
Unfortunately, that's true in politics.
Yeah, well, that's what I was about to say. Exactly, it is all about perception, and if he is now appealing to principle, and his actions actually back up the rhetoric, he has knocked back these nominations, and the House of Lords Appointments Committee did reject them, and Boris Johnson did the opposite when he put Peter Cruddas in the House of Lords. My God, he's demeaned the honours so much, hasn't he? Demeaned them, just the people that are actually in the House of Lords. That, never mind the ones he wanted to put there and failed to get over the line. He's demeaned it so much. But for you, this is improvement. It's measurable improvement.
Oh, well, look, I fully accept his measurable improvement because he believes that is politically expedient for him. But then he's a politician. Why wouldn't he? I'd probably do the same thing if I was there.
Yes.
But I think just on the point you've made on the honour system, isn't it just time that we just, overhaul that thing, for crying out loud?
I think Keir Starmer, you're about to rejoin the Conservative Party, and Keir Starmer is pledging to overhaul the honours system, man. What do you want? Make your mind up.
He's got too much other stuff going on that I can't make my mind up. I haven't voted Labour my entire life. I'm very much a One Nation Tory.
Yeah. Who speaks for you at the moment?
I don't know who does. That's the big challenge. That's the big problem I have. The reality is the One Nation caucus is frankly, irrelevant right now. Ever since Johnson threw out.
Since the cull in 2019, that you've got Grieve and Gawke, and actually Rory Stewart, of course, resigned shortly after Johnson got the leadership, so he might perhaps have been on our list. So who would you coalesce around? There's no one.
I don't know. It's so difficult, but I think the whole point of it is that I still have to persevere and try and be part of the debate as a voter. You can't walk away from it. No. I think skepticism is okay, but cynicism isn't right.
Nicely put.
So, and then if you keep doing the work that you're doing, and Nick and all the rest of it, and if less people listen to the BBC and more people listen to LBC, we will be in a better place.
We might well be in a better place. Thank you, Mohammed. I mean, a bit of BBC bashing going on today, which is to be expected, but my goodness me, there are some brilliant journalists there, and it remains, a internationally important institution. It's just a shame that so much. Well, you can spot the problems on air. They're the ones that never get criticised by the Daily Mail and never say a single word when their colleagues are. So I'll let you decide what names you're going to allow to move into that space. But there are, and I'm not going to now give you a list of the BBC journalists that I love, because that could end up in the Daily Mail as a sort of kiss of death. If you think I'm exaggerating, you haven't been paying attention. It's coming up to 12:30. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we continue to question whether Rishi Sunak's latest bid for not just for the moral high ground, but for the tough guy status as well. We used to do this thing at school. Did you do it? Where if someone was like angry and being tough, you'd go, "Ooh, smell the cheese," and you'd put a kind of piece of. No, was it just? Did you do that at school? And you do, and then you'd put it there, and then you pop them on the nose a bit. You go like that, pop. Woo! Smell the cheese, Rishi Sunak. Smell the cheese, Mr. Tough Guy. But he has. He has essentially called Johnson's bluff on this, I think, and that's politically fascinating. He has said, "No, I'm not putting these ridiculous appointments in the house." Nadine Dorries, in that you must be having a giraffe, mate. He said, "I'm putting her in the House of Lords," and he has upset Johnson. And Dorries is such a drama queen that she's fluffed off resigned entirely from the House of Commons because Rishi Sunak won't put her in the House of Lords. A true champion of the people. Nothing says anti-elite and anti-establishment than resigning from the House of Commons in protest at being refused a seat in the House of Lords. God, yeah, I've been rude about Nadine Dorries in the past, but my God, that really does demonstrate credibility and integrity. What an absolute pavlova. It's 12:30. Amelia Cox is here with your headlines. It is 34 minutes after 12, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I've just realised I'm blocked by Peter Crudders, who was put in the House of Lords by Boris Johnson, completely coincidentally, after giving £4.5 million to the Tory party and against the advice of the House of Lords Appointments Committee. But he is... He's quite a character. Here's one of his tweets from an hour ago. That's because they are scared of his popularity amongst the electorate and his potential return. Boris has a lot of options. If Boris was finished, they wouldn't bother. Remarkably, he's describing GBB's coverage of the current situation, and then lots of other sort of weird retweets of unsavoury characters. So there you go. That's the kind of character that Boris Johnson would put in the House of Lords, and Rishi Sunak has sought to distance himself from that practice. Arguably a corrupt practice, I think. If the House of Lords Appointment Committee say this person's not suitable to be in the House of Lords, and Boris Johnson says, oh, yes, he is, there's nothing that they can do to stop him. But then that Claire Fox woman got put in the House of Lords and Kate Hoey, and Zach Goldsmith, who of course led a very racist mayoral campaign against Sadiq Khan. Who else is on that list? I mean, you've got the Tweedledum and Tweedledummer, haven't you? Daniel Hannan and Daniel Moylan. Good God, why would anyone want to be in the House of Lords if there's a genuine risk of ending up sitting next to them? Should we do it off the top of our heads together then? Goldsmith, Hoey, Fox, Moylan, Hannan. Who else is there? Can we think of any others? Am I doing this all on my own? Is anyone going to help me? I've only got 5. There must be more than that. Who else has he put in there? Well, Crudders. We get Crudders for the sixer. Can we get it up to double figures before I take a phone call? But Ian Botham got put in the House of Lords shortly after. I can't tell you. I've just been writing about it in my book. I had to check my facts. Let's just say he had an unfortunate incident on Twitter and then claimed that he'd been hacked. To which my response at the time, and when I double-checked it at the weekend, was chinny reckon. So Ian Botham, I think, didn't he become a sort of trade envoy? Who else? We got the two Tweedledum and Tweedledummer, Daniel Hannan and Daniel Moylan, Claire Fox, Kate Hoey, Zach Goldsmith, Peter Crudders, Ian Botham. Let me just check Michelle Mone. Did he put Michelle Mone in the House of Lords? He did, didn't he? Michelle Mone. His brother's all right. Again, some people won't like me for this, but Mone was Cameron. Mone was Cameron. Might even have been Brown. Brown put in someone. Oh, Brown put in Digby Pudding Jones. Haven't heard from him for a while. I've got it up to 7. Have we got any others? I took the Michelle Mone from my inbox. So anyway, I'll leave it on 7. See how we get on. Tom's in County Kerry, in the old country. Tom, what would you like to say?
Oh yeah, hi James. Thanks for taking the call.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Basically, look, he can try and divorce himself as far as he wants from Johnson, but what he can't divorce himself from is the actual decisions and policies he agreed with, shall we say, instigated and put in place while Chancellor to Johnson. He played his full part in where we are now.
He did. Well,
the Brexiteer, he's a supporter of sending people to Rwanda.
Apparently.
And I could go on and on, but, that would just be repeating what's probably being said all day.
Yeah, we don't like people going on and on this programme.
No.
So God, down with that sort of thing, says the man who did a 42-minute monologue at the top of the show this morning.
Yeah. But, what I'm basically saying is kind of, here we go again. Obviously the Tory party is going to try and campaign in the next election. Oh, it's a fresh start, it's a fresh this, a fresh that. Come on, guys, you can't be falling for this again.
I'm fascinated by that, though, tactically, because there's still he is not Trump. His personal popularity, it might be high among members, but it's not even high among voters, Tory voters, traditional Tory voters. His Fox was shot years ago, months ago. But if they go in saying it's a fresh start, do they not abandon... Oh, Gisela Stewart and Evgeny Lebedev, they're on the list. Do they not abandon the Johnson fans? I mean, I appreciate there's not much else they're going to vote for unless Farage pops up with another grift.
Well, without being, parley with anybody who's actually a member of the Conservative Party, it's something I would never get near. Well, from what I can gather, and it's just mainly my point of view, is that Johnson is highly popular still amongst the membership. I'm pretty sure you can
amongst
be sure
the
of
membership, but not among the Tory voters. So I don't know what the. Yeah, go on.
But this membership, referring to your question earlier in the programme, it's the Tory membership that put him there. It's the Tory membership that kept
Yes, but
him
that's
there,
what I mean. That's what I'm
place.
asking you about. If Sunak campaigns on a clean slate, doesn't that alienate the people that we're talking about now?
Well,
because he's saying, "Oh, I'm not like him. I'm not like old Stinky Pants over there." And they're like, "But we love old Stinky Pants."
Yeah, but probably tripping myself up here, but as you rightly say, it's not the voters, but the voters could well fall for it. Let's be honest; it's happened a few times over the years.
No, of course,
we've dug up a fresh start, and
we've dug up a fresh start.
Theresa May tried it, and
I love it. We've dug up a fresh start. We've stuck him up. We've dug him up and stuck him on a like Wurzel Gummidge. And yes, I don't know. I mean, I listen just as a patriot, and it's a word I've used very sparingly because it is so vilely abused. Dr. Johnson got it right, didn't he, when he said patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel, which is a beautiful description of Johnson or Farage's so-called patriotism. But as a patriot, I want a healthy democracy. I want a healthy parliament. I want a Conservative Party that upholds real values, even if they're values I disagree with, even if I don't believe that they're values. I'm not as scorched earth as you. Maybe I'll become more cynical as I get older, but the party of Rory Stewart, David Gauke, far from perfect, and austerity and all of that, I know. But in the interest of the national interest, you want a party that is not actually lying on an industrial scale like Donald Trump's Republican Party, remoulded in his image. And so I've got a little bit more time than you for the idea that Sunak might be able to make a clean break. He might not. You might need a Michael Howard. You might need a leader who's even worse than this one, like a Duncan Smith or a Howard, as part of the rehabilitation process. So that would probably be Kemi Badenoch, would it? Someone who piles off in the opposite direction, takes things even worse. Braverman would be up for it. And then the party can start rebuilding itself. So you need a Howard before you can get a Cameron. I don't know. Denise is in Kilwinning, so we're going from Ireland to Scotland. Denise, what would you like to say?
Hiya. Thank you for the rant this morning.
Oh, you're very welcome. Wasn't a rant. Wasn't a rant. How dare you? It was a carefully considered analysis that just happened to go.
Carefully considered analysis.
You're very welcome.
Caused me to snort coffee down my nose a couple of times.
Well, I'm very glad to hear it. The highest praise. The more coffee is snorted, the happier I am. Thank you, Denise.
As far as Sunak is concerned, has he a leg to stand on? Yes. Yeah. But what you have to consider is that leg is perched atop a hooker heel in wet grass.
Yes.
He's fallen over. He has no credibility. He cannot, James, separate himself from Johnson because he greenlit paying for Bunter's lawyers. He greenlit the judicial review, which is something Bunter would have done. And he's approved the honours list sent it through.
He sent back the ones that the House of Lords Appointments Committee wouldn't sanction, so there's not a lot more he could have done in that circumstance. He couldn't start scratching Jacob Rees-Mogg off the knighthood list and stuff because he doesn't have the mandate, if that's the right word, to do that. He might have the powers. Paying the tax.
You have to think, James, if he'd withheld it just another day or two.
Yeah, I know. That looks like a misstep. It looks like a misstep, that, rather than anything else.
Would it have gone through?
I don't know.
But with all the other stuff, with the likes of Braverman and Badenoch and all the other stuff, he can't wash this stench off himself.
You don't think
he's been part of it.
But you're never going to vote for him anyway.
Not in a million years.
Yeah, well, then you don't count. You're like me. So Mohammed is the only caller. He's the only caller this hour. The only caller this hour that counts is Mohammed in Birmingham, who is potentially a Tory, resigned when Johnson became leader, and can see a way back now that Sunak is doing what he's doing.
But here's the thing. I have, God forgive me, in the past, I have considered voting Tory.
Right.
I've never gone full tonto and done it. But there have been in the past Tory policies of which I've thought that's actually not that unreasonable.
Exactly.
I can understand why they're saying that, and yes, I probably would, if I was in the Commons, vote with them on that. I can't think of one off the top of my head, but you know how it is over the years. You go, yeah, that's not entirely unreasonable.
Yeah.
I'm not too against them on that. There have been Tory politicians that I have admired for whatever reasons. That can't be denied. I'm not one of those people that says, oh, they're a Tory, everything they do and say must be wrong.
No.
There are some who obviously do follow that path, and that cannot be denied. Rees-Mogg being one of them.
Yes.
But
no, I hear you. I know what you're saying.
do you know? I mean, I
do, but not yet. Not
in
yet.
Good conscience, bring myself to vote.
You can't
Tory
give them. You can't give them the benefit of the doubt. So it will be at least one more leader before you can even take your fingers off your nose.
Well, do you know what? I don't think we're going to have one more leader in terms of in power. I strongly suspect we're going to have a GE come September.
Do you? Oh God, I hope not.
I hope so.
Really?
Because
I've got a book out in November. I've got a book out in November. Timing is everything. The book's supposed to come out before the election, not after it.
Dude, it's not all about you.
What? How long have you listened to this programme for? I think you've got through. Do you think this is 5 Live or something? Have you got through to the wrong station? Of course, it's all about.
Get you going.
It's all about me. Who do you think? God. No, I take your point. I'd be surprised though. I think Lewis nailed that particular question on Friday. The picture might have changed, of course, over the weekend with these events that we discussed, but they will string it out for as long as they can before going to the country, just on the Mr. McCorber principle. That however bad things might be now, something will come up that will mean we've got a better chance tomorrow than we have today. But you're quite right. It's not all about me. 12:48. I love it when my texts sort of run away. I don't know what they are. Partly now because people can rewind live radio using the Global Player app. So I get messages that people have obviously forgotten that they're not listening live. I get messages that might be 20 minutes or 2 hours out of date. I got one 5 minutes ago saying it was Helen Hunt in that Jack Nicholson film that I mentioned 2 hours ago. But also ones that I forget what I've said. And then you responding to it, but I forgot. So I just got a really big capital letters, Frost Man, and 20 exclamation marks. I say, Frost Man? What's that? Is that like some Marvel superhero that I haven't heard of? Oh, Frost, comma, man, exclamation mark, exclamation. He did, didn't he, put Lord Frost, David Flipping Frost in the House of Lords? So I haven't yet hit double figures on how massively demeaned yes, I have. Yeah, I've hit double figures. Are you ready? So this is my top 10 examples of how completely demeaned the honours system was by Boris Johnson even before he tried to put Nadine Dorries in the House of Lords and gave Jacob Rees-Mogg a knighthood. Are you ready for this? So you've got Peter Cruddas, actually objected to by the House of Lords Appointment Committee, Kate Hoey, Evgeny Lebedev, Gisela Stewart, Zach Goldsmith, Ian Botham, Daniel Hannan, Daniel Moylon, David Frost and Claire Fox. That's 10. Double figures. I told you we'd get there, and now you'll bombard me with suggestions that probably will bring it closer to 20 before home time today. Charles Moore as well. Yeah, good God, Charles Moore. Baron Moore. Oh dear, another key member of the Save Owen Paterson campaign. Kendi is in Reading. Kendi, what would you like to say?
Yeah, I'd like to just say that in terms of Rishi...
yes. Moral high ground. Can he get it? Can he wash off the stench of Johnson?
No, I don't think so.
Oh.
He didn't have the thought to get rid of Dominic Raab or Gavin Williamson.
Good point, yeah.
Or even Suella.
Yeah.
He's not able to keep Robert Jenrick in check. He's waging all these culture wars and conflating all these issues with legal migration and refugees.
He is.
And also, like the previous caller, based on the judicial review, I don't see it. I think he's also got skeletons in his
you mean that we haven't? We mean when the inquiry God, there's so many inquiries, isn't there? You're talking about the COVID inquiry now.
Oh, yes.
Well, I don't know when we're going to see that. I should probably get a better handle on when we're going to see it. But the WhatsApps between Johnson and Sunak now are probably going to be a lot more damaging for Sunak than they would be for Johnson, which is why they've gone to court to try to keep them out of the public's hands.
There's no integrity there.
No, but I mean, without sounding obtuse, it's and also without sounding like I'm quoting Denise, it's not all about you, because you would never. It's about the kind of people that might be susceptible to a Sunak rehabilitation, and I don't know that you're in that category, are you?
No.
No, that's the point, isn't it? You're like me, is that the stench is so far up your nostrils that you wonder whether you're ever going to get it out again. Some people really want to give Sunak a chance. I have some respect for them, actually. I can see why, but you're right. That's quite a charge sheet of things that he was either complicit in or went along with or sat on his hands. Thank you, Kendi. I'm not putting Joe Johnson. He gave Gavin Williamson a knighthood, not a seat in the House of Lords. But I mean, demeaning the honours system, you could have that as well. But I know he put his brother in the House of Lords. And I know this is quite a hard bridge to die on, but he was a decent politician. You shouldn't put your brother in the House of Lords, should you? All right, I'm putting him on the list as well. That's 12. You just can't, especially when, didn't his brother Joe Johnson resign because he knew how terrible Boris Johnson would be, and then accepted a seat in the House of Lords from Boris Johnson? It's a miracle he didn't end up on LBC. Freddie's in Lincoln. Freddie, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi, James.
Hello, Freddie.
So, I think I'm one of the rare Tory members that did want to give Sunak a chance at the start.
Good.
I did vote for him in the leadership election, and I thought, you know what, as long as he just doesn't do anything stupid, no scandals, no nothing, we'll have a chance.
Yes, I think you were right.
As soon as he reappointed Suella Braverman, I knew it was over.
Right.
I knew it was over. I just think that he's got no backbone.
He's trying to sound tough today. It hasn't washed with you.
No, it hasn't. And I think he's trying to keep every faction of the Conservative Party happy, whether that be the ERG or the immigration hardliners or whatever. And by doing that, he's managed to fracture the entire party.
He's inherited he's inherited fractures. I mean, at some point, someone is going to have to do what Mohammed referred to, and which I sense would involve you as well, or include you as well, which is resurrect one nation Toryism. At some point, he's going to have to, not him, someone's going to have to steer the party back to a place where, Rory Stewart and Dominic Grieve could sit comfortably.
Yeah, no, I mean, I do agree. I think they've completely missed the mark on what things, I don't know, what issues matter to voters. I think, the younger guy, I'm thinking, okay, inflation, wages, housing crisis, NHS. I mean, had to go to A&E a few months ago, and it was an 8-hour wait for a CT scan. They're the things that matter to me, and I'm not really that bothered. Well, it is an issue about the tens of thousands of people crossing illegally.
But if you were, and we won't have an argument now about the use of the word illegally, but if you were very bothered about that, then the news today that this weekend was one of the highest crossing numbers ever would be enraging you. So he's not even keeping them sweet.
He's not even winning that, because if I was someone who sat there, and I agree with you, I'm not necessarily there on the word illegal. I do agree with you in that respect. But if I was, say, the Brexit hardline,
you'd be even angrier.
So in fact, even angrier because I've been I've voted for these plonkers for the past 13 years. You've told me they're going to get immigration down, and I'm sat here listening to James O'Brien tell me that we've had record immigration. What was the point in voting them in?
Record crossings this weekend, and of course record figures overall. So if that was your guiding light, you'd be let down as well. And actually, that Crudders bloke that I referred to, he's retweeting Nigel Farage's old communications secretary.
Talk to you about Nigel Farage.
Well, we might have to at some point, although I've enjoyed the interregnum. I don't know if we will ever have to. So, Freddie, thank you. So what are you waiting? No, hang on, before you go, what are you waiting for then post-Sunak? Because it's probably going to get worse before it gets better from your...
perspective.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I think we need a strong leader. I know.
Can you see anyone in the wings?
I think Michael Gove.
No, good God. No. What? That was a...
Wait.
That's never happened to me on the radio before. That was completely authentic, that response then.
Hang on a minute, James. My only point was that he seems... He's well-spoken. He can take some responsibility for his actions.
Yeah.
I don't think he's that amazing of a politician.
You mean a holding pattern? He might be a holding
My only point is just someone to not get us absolutely murdered. Not that I want him to be Prime Minister.
That makes two of you.
I'm looking at the current crop that I've got to select from, and he seems like the least worst option.
Okay. No, I asked, and I actually understand why. And do you know, there was a point, regular listeners will attest, or at least long-suffering listeners will attest, there was a point where I would have agreed with you about that. But that little scream there, that's never happened to me before, I don't think, on the radio. I've never actually gone, a proper little shiver, woof. Thank you, Freddie. Claire's in York. Claire, what's going on?
Hi, I'm really shocked that you're even giving Sunak the benefit of the doubt.
Oh, everyone's a critic. I'm hardly giving him the benefit of the doubt by asking whether you're giving him the benefit of the doubt, am I?
He's done so many things that I just think are disgraceful. But there's three main ones, and the worst one is the COVID inquiry.
Yeah.
I mean, that is the bedrock of our democracy, to be able to scrutinise our government, and he is spending millions of our taxpayers' money to try and hide the truth from us, and he's doing everything he possibly can. And I just think that's unforgivable. And
you can't say with absolute certainty that he is doing what you described. For the record, I agree with you, and if he is just trying to keep private, irrelevant exchanges out of the public eye, then the question of why he's spending so much money to do it becomes a bit odd, doesn't it?
The judge should choose. I mean,
I agree.
The government is asking us to trust them, and yet the government are saying it's okay for them to not trust a highly respected High Court judge, who everyone else in this land has to abide by judges.
You're very right.
So the government should. And the next thing that is I just find unforgivable is that he stands by and allows Braverman to speak with dangerous, inflammatory, racist language, which he either knows better and says nothing, which is despicable, or he believes the rhetoric, and that is despicable.
Fair enough.
And it's just disgusting. And he also has just decided not to go after the PPE fraud.
Is that number 3?
Yeah.
You brought it in bang on time. You're better at this than I am, Claire. So the proper investigations into PPE and PPE VIP.
I mean, this is the bedrock of our democracy.
Oh, hang on a minute. I thought the COVID inquiry was the bedrock of our democracy. How many bedrocks have you got up there in York?
Well, the PPE is part of the COVID inquiry.
Yes, you're right. And it is the bedrock of our democracy. Proper scrutiny of the government, ideally, by checks and balances. Used to be the job of journalists, thankfully. There's a few. Sheila Fogarty's just walked in. Thankfully, there are a few left who still consider that to be part of their remit.
I agree with everything that lady just said, by the way.
I'm Claire for Prime Minister, as far as I'm concerned. Absolutely. I agree with every syllable of what... Claire, I've got to go, because you can tell Sheila's itching to get started. If you miss any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you can, of course, rewind live radio and confuse presenters by texting them in response to things that they said 2 hours ago. You can also enjoy the whole show podcast, where you'll also find at Global Player all our shows to catch up on and all our live radio stations. So download Global Player for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Tom Swarbrick with you at 4. Sheila Fogarty with you now. 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 Sheila Fogarty with you now.